I uploaded one of my first video essays onto YouTube 2 years ago. It was called The Most Underrated FNAF Fangame, a video centered entirely around Project Readjusted 3, a small game with a ton of polish that flew under the radar. To this day, it is the most proud I've ever been with a video, and it's definitely shaped how I make videos today. I really didn't know if that video would do well. In fact, I had planned on it flopping pretty hard, so in my writing, I did what I could to put the game in the best light possible. So if someone with more publicity than me wanted to give the game a chance, they'd be more inclined to play it. Against all odds, it worked, and Project Readjusted 3 made a massive surge in the community. However, there was a minor issue. The way I wrote that video kept me from going too deep into the game's story and post-game content. I intended to get as many people to play the game as possible, while also saving its best moments to be uncovered. So because of that odd writing choice, I never fully immersed myself in the series, and also because I really didn't need to. You can play Project Readjusted 3 without playing any of the other games since its story is so straightforward. You can piece together quite a bit of the series' lore from what you learn in PR3. However, the usual issues arose when trying to form a complete narrative with only a third of the content. I was sitting on this absolute goldmine of a story, which I found upsetting as I never took the time to understand it fully. So that's what I did. I took a deep dive into the Project Readjusted series to learn as much about it as possible. And what I found was pretty shocking. A whole catalog of projects, some unannounced, some unreleased, and some scrapped entirely, never to be seen again. So today, I want to take you on that same deep dive to get a closer look at what we've been missing out on. I want to look at everything this series offers, from its games and lore to its odd development. And because of that, I hope this video is the ultimate look into the Project Readjusted series. Alright, enough waffling. I've wanted to talk about this series for the past 2 years, so here we go. Before we can talk about any of the games, it's essential to establish the series and the prominent people involved. Project Readjusted is a Five Nights at Freddy's fan series created by indie developer Restless. It's a mostly original series, using only the essential elements that originated from the FNAF series. There are 3 main games. A failed spin-off was released before this, which technically makes the main game spin-offs. You know what, it is complicated. All you need to know is that Restless is the primary developer, and all the games have been made up almost entirely by him. Occasionally, Restless will bring on a small group of people, usually at most 5, to help out. That is only the case for the main entries, as all of the other side projects Restless has done on the series have been entirely solo. For a series that has been around as long as this, having a series maintain almost complete independence from one person is rare. That should be enough context to finally talk about the first game in the series. Believe it or not, the first game in the Project Readjusted series is not Project Readjusted 1, nor is it a game that shares the same name. This is Project Adjusted, a short but sweet game created by Ball sometime between 2016 and 2017. But wait, I can hear you ask, you just said that Project Readjusted was an original series by Restless. Who is this Ball? Well, this is just Restless, but under a different name. It's interesting to see him at the time going by something different. In fact, Restless had a ton of name changes during his time developing the Project Readjusted series. For simplicity's sake, we'll just call him Restless from here on out, but I'll be sure to add each name change to this newly established Restless name counter, because my hyperfixation on this series is more dire than you may think. Anyway, Project Adjusted is Restless's first game, or at least the first documented one, so credit where credit is due, it's a functional game, something my first game was far from. So now that I've established one thing I like about the game, I feel comfortable telling you that this game kinda sucks. Project Adjusted is very rough around the edges. It reminds me a lot of the first build of Five Nights at Treasure Island. This game was so inherently far from functional that a whole fleet of indie developers have thrown their hand in fixing it. Unlike Treasure Island, however, Project Adjusted has never been finished, or at least brought up to fill its potential. It's always been this awkward starter game that even its own developer swept under the rug. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I would sweep this under the rug too. There isn't even a single redeeming quality about it. That's a sentiment that a lot of other people share too. The game opens up on this weird sister location-esque cutscene as the camera slowly pans upwards towards the face of an animatronic. It's important to note that literally none of this is canon. I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but I was reminded by the flashing date in the bottom left that this game takes place in 1978. Dates have always been super weird in the Project Readjusted series, but as we'll come to find out much later, most of this series takes place in the late 90s into the early 2000s. After the cutscene finishes, we're put into the main menu with a pretty decent theme playing in the background. Menu themes have always been this series' strong suit. It's just banger after banger, and they always get better with every new entry. We also get another look at 2 of the animatronics. I'll save some time by telling you that the blue one is named Glancer and the pink one is named Glossy. What exactly they are is unknown, but it's revealed that Glancer is a candy alien, whatever that is, so I would assume that Glossy is of a similar species. After pressing New Game, we are thrown straight into the night. No title card or transition. This game wastes no time getting to the point. We're put in this FNAF 3 inspired office. This giant glass window gives us a good view of anything coming through the entrance on the left side of the office. Speaking of the doorway, there's a button near it to close the door. It works the same as any other door in a FNAF game, the only difference is that the door will open back up after a short period. In the original FNAF, Fangame mentions how the doors will open automatically when the power goes out as a safety feature. This never made any sense to me. If the power went out, wouldn't they stay closed since there's nothing to power the doors? Having the doors open automatically after a period of time makes much more sense if you're designing an office with safety in mind. While I like to believe that the door functions this way because it logically makes more sense, Mechless probably did this so he wouldn't have to program a power system. And it's not like I can blame him much. I may be stupid. We get a phone call voiced by none other than Mechless, who gives us all the exposition we need. Glancer is the only character active on night 1, and he maintains a set path as he makes his way to the office. He also refers to Glancer as Glance Trap a couple of times. I couldn't tell you what this means because it's never mentioned again. I started looking into it and was eventually led to the Project Readjusted wiki, which might actually be the funniest wiki page ever written, probably because Mechless made the majority of it. The page reveals new information about Glancer despite never being mentioned in the game. My favorite has to be the random stab at anyone who died to him. It's also revealed here that Glancer was created by Mechless, the same guy who made Tekken Sons. He also made the models for this game, which I was surprised by solely because these models look terrible, and the improvement from this to Tekken Sons is insane. Back in the game, Mechless also explains that there is a way to see out of the front window by introducing this new mechanic called the Zap. You have limited zap power, and each time you light up the hallway, it takes away 10%. It does recharge over time in increments of 5%, so it's not like there's a real risk of using the Zap too frequently. Also, while Mechless is talking, a power generator starts losing power in one of the rooms. It's never explained at all in any of the phone calls, which is odd seeing as there was so much emphasis on it. I definitely think Mechless should have explained it during the call because it's up to us to figure out what it does. Thankfully, an indicator similar to FNAF 2 shows the power generator is losing charge and we have to go wind it. While all of this is happening, you have Glancer, who should be nearing your office. You can die before the phone call ends, which happened to me. Twice. I think that warrants a quick discussion on how awful the game's balancing is. Glancer moves from the stage, to the dining area, a service hall, and then in front of your door. The service hall is a pretty good distance away from the office, and there's only one camera on his path before he gets to you. So you have to guess whenever he shows up at the door. And even then, if you somehow manage to get the timing down and prevent him from entering, he doesn't leave right away. Sometimes he'll take longer than the door can stay down for, so instead of taking time to do anything else while waiting, you have to sit there and press the door button the second it's available to ensure that he won't get in. And sometimes that doesn't even work. I died once because he got through in that sliver of time between door presses. The balancing is an absolute mess, and nearly every death I had in this game can be attributed to something that wasn't even my fault. Another point I want to briefly mention before I move on is Night 4. In Project Readjusted, there are 3 main nights. When you download Project Readjusted, it comes with a README document. The document gives a basic synopsis of the game and a small guide for anyone willing to make content. It mentions what I just said, 3 main nights and an extra 4th night. The thing is, it stated how Night 4 is straight up impossible. Why? 5 Nights at Chuck E. Cheese's Rebooted is a good example. Its proper max mode, True Nightmare, can be completed consistently if you give it a lot of attempts. Its ultimate max mode, True Nightmare All Challenges, can be beaten, but more practice is required. Both of these are good examples of final challenges in a FNAF game. Both of these were at one point considered impossible. However, the amount of care put into them sets them apart from Project Readjusted's Night 4. True Nightmare and its challenge mode were constructed to push the player's limits to what one can do given enough time and dedication. Every mechanic comes together to form this ultimate endurance test. Night 4, on the contrary, takes an extreme amount of luck. If you were to sit down and grind this out, you would not improve in the slightest at the game. It just shows how no thought and care was put into it. It's all artificial difficulty. Difficulty is something I have super strong feelings towards, and it was the perfect example of what not to do. Spoiler, this is the only time in any of these games that I've had a massive issue with balancing, so hopefully it's comforting to know that Mechless quickly learned from this. Anyway, if you somehow manage to defend yourself from Glancer long enough, you should be able to move on to Night 2. Mechless calls again, and explains that since the restaurant has gotten incredibly popular during the day, they've brought in a new animatronic. The animatronic in question goes by the name Balloon Baby Bill. I wish I was joking. Balloon Baby Bill is a baby version of a Nightmare Balloon Boy, but with hollowed eyes and wearing a diaper. His model is just atrocious. It reminds me of that hideous looking baby from the Tin Toy Pixar short from the late 80s. I was wondering how a name this goofy ended up in Project Adjusted, and it's for the same reason Glancer is in the game. The character is also Mechless's, so I'm guessing that Mechless just used everything he could get. Balloon Baby Bill resides on the far left side of the office, slumped over. Mechless explains over the phone that he's connected to some wires in the office. At the same time, the staff works on getting him suitable for the customers. I don't know who would willingly pay to see a half-naked robot baby, but the 70s were a different time. Occasionally, Balloon Baby Bill will laugh and look up at the player. When this happens, he'll slowly drain power from the zap. If all of the zap power is depleted, he'll kill you. So there's another reason not to run out of the zap power. You have to click on him to temporarily disable him. Not much else happens for the rest of the night besides Glancer still being a pain to deal with. Night 3 adds Glossy, the Robin to Glancer's Batman. Glossy straight up sucks. I got nothing better to say. So, Glossy, very much similar to Glancer, will advance until she's at the office window looking in towards you. When she laughs, you have to use your zap. Glossy is arguably the biggest missed potential in the entire game. Let me explain. Besides the 4 main cameras that Glancer can use, multiple unused cameras exist. One is a vent camera, and by looking around, you can see the vents have numerous entry points into the office. So, if that's the case, why is this not utilized? That got me thinking, how could you rework Glossy to use some of the cameras? Here's what I came up with. I'm essentially rehashing Redeemer's mechanic in Project Readjusted, but stick with me here. Why not have Glossy crawl through the vents? I know, crazy. When she eventually makes her way in, you must either stare at her or leave your monitor up depending on which side she enters from. It's a simple enough mechanic to program, and it utilizes the vent camera in both entrances to the office. What annoys me even more is that Glossy's wiki page states that at one point, her mechanic would have been the exact mechanic I just suggested. So why remove it? Many of Project Adjusted's faults come from the fact that Mechless needed to be more experienced with Click Team at this point in time. He would later turn this into his biggest strength, but for right now, it's his most significant handicap. And my biggest handicap is how annoying Night 3 is. The game increased in difficulty again, and it felt worse to play than ever. It did take me a couple of tries, but I eventually finished it. All you unlock after completing Night 3 is the Extras menu. It gives basic character descriptions and insight into the game's paper-thin lore. There's also a challenge mode up above. I don't know if this is Night 4 or something else, I've yet to try it. However, from the only YouTube video covering it, it seems to be the max mode. Judging by the fact that they died to both Glancer and Glossy at the same time, I took that as my sign to not even attempt playing it. And that's really about it for Project Adjusted. I'm shocked I had this much to say about this one. I really wanted to rip on the game for a few minutes and move on, but surprisingly I found myself getting highly invested in this awful game. Really goes to show how deep the Project Readjusted brain rot is getting. This is the one game in the series I strongly recommend you refrain from playing. I don't think my words can even convey how awful an experience this was. Okay, let's finally talk about a Project Readjusted game. I didn't realize it until I played this, but I remember seeing screenshots and small snippets of gameplay when I was a lot younger. This game somehow slipped into my subconscious for many years without me knowing. So, at least for the time, this series wasn't as underground as I thought. I mean, there clearly was a demand for the game considering it garnered much more support when it was announced as opposed to Project Adjusted 2. Let's take a step back for a moment. In the time after Mechless released Project Adjusted, he would begin work on smaller projects with other developers. He would start teasing Project Adjusted 2 in May of 2017, and development would be stable for a few months until that August, when Mechless announced a remake of Project Adjusted, titled Project Readjusted. The game was initially teased as a remake, but also a sequel. All that was known at the time was this game's new primary antagonist, this dog character. Also in the same image, we get to see Mechless' second name change to Mechlazalis, but it would be later abbreviated to Mecha in future posts. From what we know, the development for Project Readjusted went without much issue, as a release date was given only 2 months after the game was announced in a teaser with this weird Ennard-esque character. And just as the teaser said it would, Project Readjusted was released on October 16, 2017 to a considerably larger audience than what Project Adjusted launched with. Mechless would update the game a couple times throughout the month, even showing off a custom-made Project Readjusted hoodie. It's not really important, but this was too funny not to include. After around Halloween, Mechless went silent on the Game Jolt page, which was odd considering how he had a habit of posting something new every few days. He mentioned how he wanted to expand his horizons by throwing his hand at a non-FNAF horror game, in favor of a third adjusted game. Those plans were evidently aborted shortly after, because he actually spent most of that time updating Project Readjusted, improving it slightly with each update. This went on until April 2018, when Mechless couldn't update the game any further due to ClickTeam's memory limit. This is a massive factor for most fan games banning ClickTeam, especially those that are super ambitious. So for Mechless, running into this issue so soon was demotivating. He decided that his best course of action was to completely rehaul the game. This would include a pretty sizable gameplay rebalance, visual improvements, and a better story. When this version of Project Readjusted went on to release a month later in May, it was deemed the official version. This made the version that had been released previously that past October the Legacy Edition. For this section, I want to talk about the new version. This is not only because its story is canon, but also because it's a much better experience overall. Right off the bat, this game, while definitely dated, is a massive step up in quality from Project Adjusted. Everything I pointed out as a flaw in that game has been improved. However, even if it is definitely a better experience as opposed to Adjusted, it still manages to create its own unique set of problems. Project Readjusted opens up on its menu, which, in all honesty, is pretty good. It's pretty standard for me to rip on these games whenever I have the chance, but credit where credit is due, this menu does a good job of setting the tone for the game. There's also a lot of really cool additions, like how on the menu's upper right hand side is a button to view your game statistics. These include your deaths, times you have successfully defended against an enemy, and a lot of cool stuff like that. Come to think of it, I don't think I've ever seen this before, so I'm glad in a game like Project Readjusted, there's something else to make it stand out. In addition to all the new menu features, we also can see Mechless' third name change to Mechlolin on the main menu at the bottom right. Put it on the board. With not much else to do on the menu, starting a new game is our best option. We load into this cutscene, which seems to take place outside the restaurant. A shadowy figure lurks in the background. We hear a phone ringing just before we can make any assumptions about what's going on. This is not a cutscene. It is instead where the phone calls will take place each night. The shadowy figure is the character we're going to encounter that night. This was a change made in the new version. Initially, the phone call would occur during the night, but in this version they take place before, as if someone's informing you ahead of time what you're going to encounter. This also serves as an excellent way to build ambience and tension in the first night, not having anyone keep you company, but instead being left in complete isolation. It's a great idea in concept, but in practice, for a game like Project Readjusted, it doesn't work well. You see, these phone calls can get really long. A game like this would benefit the player if they could adjust to the new environment while listening. It also makes the earlier nights more interesting, so they don't have to wait for the characters to move around until much later. That alone is one of my massive complaints about Project Readjusted. There is so much dead time that could be used more effectively. This really isn't much of an issue later on, but it's very noticeable in the first few nights. During the phone call, Mechless reprises his role of phone guy to introduce us to our new job. You can tell he recorded these in one take with the amount of ums and uhs. So we applied over the phone to be a night watchman at an abandoned Buster's restaurant. The people we are working for are investigating the place to find a computer chip. What this chip does isn't explained at the moment, but it has something to do with the animatronics. Phone Guy also describes briefly how to deal with Buster, an animatronic dog who is the main star of the restaurant. He works fundamentally similar to Glancer from Project Adjusted. He will go from the stage to the dining area, a hall, and then your office. This time, the way to deal with Buster is by holding a light on his face when visible in the doorway. It's a more interesting mechanic than just shutting a door, however, it's simple enough for anyone to grasp for a first night. In fact, nothing else very notable happens for the rest of the night. It's just getting used to Buster and this weird work schedule. Can we talk about this for a moment? In Project Readjusted, for some reason, instead of a typical 12 AM to 6 AM, it's instead 9 PM to 3 AM. Even if it makes no difference to the gameplay, I find it strange that you start at 9 and leave at 3 in the morning. For some places it's a typical workday, but I get the impression it's another case of Mechless trying to make his game stand out by altering the formula slightly. It's just odd enough to get people to differentiate it from other games. After the first night ends, an actual cutscene plays. It depicts a conversation between two people. They seem to have a rocky relationship as they seem untrusting of each other. One of them then mentions something inside the Buster's diner. They then say they need to lure whatever it is out. The other suggests hiring a guy to enter and lure it out for them. The only issue is they only have 5 days. The cutscene ends, and we're put back on the menu. I don't need a PhD to tell you that these two are the ones investigating Busters, and you are the person they hired. It's a little to go off of to form a complete picture, but it's enough to give us the impression that we shouldn't completely trust our employer. The second night begins with another phone call. This time, Phone Guy explains a new character known to crawl around through the vents. This is Redeemer, easily the most unique and underutilized character this series has seen. Redeemer is an older version of Buster. It has missing eyes and a torn suit, but still works. In general, Redeemer has a bulkier and more threatening presence than Buster, which makes a lot of sense since he is older. What doesn't make sense is how little importance he actually has to the story. For a character with a name like Redeemer, you would think there would be more relevance surrounding him, but no. He is just an older version of Buster, and that's about it. Maybe he would have been crucial at one point, but since the story has changed quite a bit in between games, those plans most likely have changed a bit. Redeemer will crawl through the vents and eventually end up in your office on the floor near the bottom right. We need to keep our monitor up until he leaves. What I like about Redeemer's mechanic is that while you can see him enter the office, he isn't visible to the player when the camera is up. You must listen for a faint audio cue to suggest that he's crawled back into the vents. Come to think of it, audio cues play a much more significant role in this game. Buster, for example, will play an audio cue each time he's moved. It sometimes works, but when it does, it can be super beneficial, especially in the later nights when you can't focus entirely on Buster. Overall, Night 2 isn't the most challenging night, but it's these small steps in difficulty that Project Readjusted was lacking. The post-night cutscene confirms our earlier suspicions that these two are our employers. Also confirmed is that our name is Hayden. Other than that, there really isn't much else in this one. Which is fine, because on Night 3 a lot more happens. Firstly, Fangame introduces us to another oddly underutilized character. This is Ned, an animatronic take on an alien bee and wasp hybrid. He's got arguably the weirdest design out of any character in the series. Paired with the bright yellow color scheme, he sticks out like a sore thumb. While making my PR3 video 2 years ago, I remember while researching, I kept seeing photos of Ned pop up. I kept wondering how Ned would be implemented into the story. I don't think Mechless knows what purpose he serves either, as his character is wholly abandoned after this game. Phone Guy says that Ned was the original entertainer of the diner, which makes no sense considering the place is named after Buster. Why would they switch names to accommodate a new character? And if they didn't, why even name it Buster's in the first place? I actually asked this question, and the response I got was that Ned was the main antagonist of Project Readjusted before Buster. Still, he decided to implement him in the game despite no other real reason than just to fill a roster spot. Ned's mechanic is probably my favorite in the entire game. He'll move from the parts and service room, almost doing a lap around the building before ending up at the hall on your right and sneaking in. Once he gets too close, you're dead. There's really nothing you can do at that point. You're supposed to be proactive in the cameras and use the replace machinery button. This will send him back one position. The button will work every time without fail, but it's not entirely risk-free. I should have mentioned thus far that the camera panel has a stability meter that is constantly taking down whenever it's in use. If the stability reaches 0, it would shut off and would only work once sufficiently charged. This has never really been an issue up until now since Buster has always been the primary focus on the cameras, and Redeemer only requires the panel to be up for at most 5 seconds. The problem comes in when you're trying to track Buster and Ned, who are on opposite sides of the restaurant. The replace machinery button takes a couple of seconds after it's pressed to send Ned back, and once it's pressed, the camera panel is essentially useless until it's done. So Ned's addition becomes this balancing act between finding good times to send him back while occasionally looking for Buster and finally finding a few seconds to put the camera down to recharge. It is only the third night, but I'm glad that arguably the most resource-intensive character has been added now and not later on. The Night 3 cutscene only adds a little bit to what we already know. We accepted the job because we needed the cash, but from the conversation between the two, it seems as if they knew the job would be dangerous. If only they were a workers' comp. Night 4, shit gets real. Kind of. Phone Guy tells us that there are 2 new animatronics that we have to deal with. The first is this clown named Greg. Greg is your Balloon Boy equivalent because he's really only there to mess you up. And if you don't click on him in enough time, he'll move up to the light button, preventing it from being used. He's never really that much of a threat, but he has messed me up a couple of times and even caused a death. The second character is Glancy. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Glancy is a fusion of Glancer and Glossy from Project Readjusted. Like almost every character, Glancy is an odd addition to the game. The only real explanation that Phone Guy gives for its existence is that both Glancer and Glossy were sitting in the back room, their suits incomplete, and someone decided to sew them together. Besides that, Glancy does not need to exist. They had a minor cameo in PR2, but other than that, they were promptly forgotten. Anyway, Glancy will start off in the backstage alongside Ned. Every time they move forward, they'll make a pretty loud noise. They aim to make it to the supply closet to disable our camera panel. Once that happens, they'll rush into the office. We need to turn off the lights in the supply closet once they're there. This will confuse them, and they'll return to wherever they started. Glancy isn't really much of a threat once you have your cycle of dealing with Buster and Ned down. He only shows up to the supply closet once, maybe twice, and he only falls into place when Buster and Ned are gone. The fourth post-night cutscene finally shows the two going inside the restaurant. Well, saying that we're shown this is a bit generous. Still, it's implied that they finally go inside. Most of it is spent in the perspective of one of the guys as he sets up the office. Also confirmed is one of the guys' names, Andrew, who is revealed to be the phone guy. Somewhere in all of this, they split up. Andrew goes outside to record the phone calls, and the other guy is inside setting up the office. After Andrew comes back inside from recording, the two hear something approaching. When it does, Andrew is instructed by the other guy to run and leave him behind. The two split up once again, and the cutscene ends. Night 5 starts with Phone Guy, now confirmed to be named Andrew, telling us about the sixth and final character to watch out for. Their name is Vinard, and it's the animatronic housing the chip he and his friend want. Vinard is this goblin-like character with a Funtime-esque look. He was suited with wheels because he was intended to be this super interactive entertainer who adapts to his environment. However, he was found to be hostile during testing. Spoiler, it's probably from the chip, which is essentially why Andrew and his friend are after it. Vinard now resides in the control module and can only mess with your camera panel. Occasionally during the night, a blinking warning sign will appear on the minimap. We have to turn off the lights in whatever room we're on. This is supposed to stop Vinard from making his way towards you, since he can't adapt to an environment he can't see. Once you've adjusted to fit Vinard in with every other character, which takes like 10 seconds, Night 5 is a cakewalk. My general strategy that worked pretty effectively was to cycle between the party hall, supply closet, and office corner. This cycle is beneficial in dealing with pretty much every threat. The party hall works well for dealing with Ned since he has two positions in that camera, so the majority of the time he'll be in that hall. Considering that Ned isn't the primary focus in most cases, you can judge more effectively whether or not you need to take time to deal with him. He also has one more frame after he leaves, so while keeping him there is a priority, it allows you a bit of breathing room if you need to focus on someone else. The other two cameras are self-explanatory. Check the supply closet for Glancy, and check the office corner to know when Buster will be at your door. Besides that, keep the camera down for most of the night and quickly act on Redeemer, Vinard, and Greg. The entire game, including the max mode, can be beaten fairly easily with this strategy. And believe it or not, that's really about it for Project Readjusted. What, you thought there was more to the story? Yeah, surprisingly not. There isn't a cutscene after Night 5, nor is there one for beating Daredevil or any of the custom night challenges for that matter. As it turns out, the endings for this game are programmed, but the event to fire those cutscenes isn't. What we roughly know from a screenshot shared by Mechless is that Andrew does, in fact, come back inside the restaurant, presumably after a bit of time has passed, and sees that Vinard has been disabled and the chip has been removed. It also implies that what Andrew's friend did was a little bit more than just disabling Vinard. It sounds like Andrew found something, but it's never confirmed or brought up again. So I guess we'll never know. My guess is that it has something to do with a murder, like someone's body was found near the Vinard suit, if that at all makes sense. It'll make sense later when we get to a point in PR2, but for now, we don't even have a clue aside from a cutscene images found within the game files. That's really where the story ends. Andrew's friend disappeared, leaving Andrew wondering where he went. There is still more to Project Readjusted, like the somewhat recoded Night 3 of Project Adjusted, and even a bit of a scrap build of Project Adjusted 2. But even with those extras, Project Readjusted is still a solid game, even if it is buggy and somewhat incomplete. Still, it's better than what I was told it was going to be going in. But you know what I wouldn't hold off on? Project Readjusted 2. Yeah, amazing segue, I know. Jumping ahead a few months, after the successful re-release of Project Readjusted, Mechless would set out for another project to readjust. Project Readjusted 2! Teased almost exclusively as this massive announcement, Project Readjusted 2 was first revealed in July 2018. The game would undergo numerous iterations before finally landing on a final design and releasing on February 23, 2019. Even if it was a couple of months after its announcement, Mechless was hard at work at the time making sure that this game was undoubtedly his best. And while now that sentiment doesn't particularly hold up, this project stood pretty firm on its own at the time. He has been gone for so long, it's only a matter of time before he shows his face, but I cannot wait any longer. I need answers to my questions. But where did he go? The description reads. It's a simple synopsis, but one that perfectly captures what the point of Project Readjusted 2 is. It's not some cheap sequel that, let's be honest here, was highly prevalent at the time. This game is an actual continuation of the story that's starting to get interesting. Opening up the game for the first time is a vast improvement over Project Readjusted, which also happened to be a vast improvement over Project Adjusted. Improvement is a common theme with this series, as each entry, hell, each update feels better to play. A great example of this is the menu theme itself. This time, this catchy and intense piece that perfectly accompanies the other elements on the menu. I know the menu theme is something I've brought up before, and I will bring it up again, trust me, but nailing the small details right from the start makes this series feel so good to play. To the far right is an animatronic. It's entirely random which one is on screen, but it shuffles between a messed up looking version of Buster and this other blue character. The text in the top left, reminding us what game we're playing, spazzing out to the beat of the song, also helps contribute to what is generally an intense looking menu. At the bottom left is a button for a shop, something that you don't see very much in fan games. It offers cosmetics for the office, as well as this box. We can earn tokens after completing a shift, and the amount you collect increases with the difficulty. It's a neat system, and it's probably one of the first instances that something similar has been made in a fan game. It shows that the game was created by Restless. But hold on a minute, any video playthrough of PR2 when it was released will show something different. That's right, it's Restless's fourth name change, this time to Mech 13 Games. To be honest, I like this change a lot, even if having numbers in your name is pretty stupid. Wait a minute. After pressing new game, a cutscene plays in a similar style to those found in the first game. We're playing as Andrew, the phone guy from PR1, who is still on the hunt for his friend that mysteriously left him at the end of that game. As we'll come to find in greater detail later on, Andrew is pretty resourceful. We can even see some of that character trait in this game, as Andrew whittles down the possible places for his friend to be at. He deduces that they're hiding in the Buster's location that is currently being renovated. We see that there's an open position as a night guard, and the cutscene ends as it fades to black to start the first night. We load into the office, and since most of the game takes place here, let's take some time to get used to it. We are at Diner World Supply and Storage Facility, which is being renovated into a Buster's. This is all revealed to us through a phone call from someone who isn't Restless this time. The voice is of Najepson, who I'm relatively sure that this is their only voice acting role. Regardless, they do a pretty decent job here. It's nice to have a new voice in this series. Phone Guy also gives us the basic rundown, where we are, what's happening, and what characters will move around. He cuts right to the chase after implying that we worked previously at the old Buster's location. The one character active tonight is Cable Buster, whom Phone Guy calls an older version of Buster. Cable Buster is old, but most of it still works, as the company is trying to restore it for use when the restaurant opens. He isn't to be confused with Redeemer, who is another old variant of Buster. Cable Buster will wander around the building in two paths, splitting up to either go to the west or east hall once he leaves the supply room. Which way he goes doesn't necessarily matter, as there are two cameras between you and him in either path. Once Buster gets to his closest position from your office before killing you, his voice box will activate and he'll say a day of the week. We must input that same day into the speaker back in the supply room. It will call him back since he's attracted to noise. It works pretty well if you can hear Buster, which is sometimes an issue as there'll be other things going on in the background that could distract from Buster. Other than that, Night 1 is more of an introduction to the new environment and tools without the difficulty we'll experience much later. After our first shift, we get another cutscene from our perspective. We found that in a newspaper, a missing person was last seen at the old Buster's location. It said that the missing person is the spy that Matthew took care of. There are a couple things to mention here. First, we have a name for Andrew's friend, so I can stop calling him that. Matthew had seemingly killed and taken care of a spy. This is who I believe the person in the true ending of Project Readjusted was. Since we don't have a visual, I assume that the spy showed up at the Buster's restaurant, and Matthew told Andrew to run. Matthew kills the spy, takes the chip out of Innard, and leaves. That's entirely speculation, by the way. It's never really confirmed what happens at that moment, but it's probably my best interpretation of it. Now that we've established Matthew as a character, it's crucial that you remember that name. Not only because it's undoubtedly the best name, speaking from experience, but he's also the single most important character going forward. After the cutscene fades to black, we load into a minigame. This minigame is interesting, and not in a good way. This was scrapped in most versions of the game and was only brought back with the very recent patch, so not a lot of people actually know how to play it. I am not one of those people. I'm sorry, I tried to learn how to play this, but I just couldn't do it. And since you have to replay the first night over and over again to get another shot at it, I figured it wasn't entirely worth it. On top of that, this minigame is still pretty bugged. There's about a 75% chance that this section will soft lock your game, leaving you stuck until you restart. The minigame is intended to have you secure the building in exchange for 10 tokens. You're supposed to charge your security meter up to 100%, but every time you turn to your left, it resets. Looking to your left is only really important so you see how close Buster is to attacking. Other than that, you have to use your resources given on the computer to survive. Again, I couldn't figure this out. If someone wants to give this a try, please let me know how you complete this. Moving on to night 2, there's a new section on the camera panel for the air ducts. Phone Guy explains that he's enabled it in case a rat enters. Likely story, because the real rat is Glancer. He's back, in infested form. Glancer is kind of a weird character to add if you really think about it, but he oddly makes the most sense for a reason the game will tell us in a little bit. Right now though, Glancer will get in through the air ducts through a backstage area. Once he's in, where he goes is pseudo-random. I want to talk a little bit more in depth about Glancer's mechanic, more specifically how he moves through the air ducts, But for right now, all you need to know is that he can come from any of the 3 openings that are above the office. Glancer moves in silence, so tracking his movement can be especially difficult. The radar, however, allows you to see his exact location for a few seconds before taking a little longer to recharge. We have to seal off whichever side of the vent he's coming from to prevent him from getting in. You can only have one door down at a time, and by having a door down, you have to worry about its power. Thankfully, it can be rebooted at any time, but it's still incredibly sketchy. Glancer's mechanic to me feels like they want you to stick with your gut instead of knowing if you're safe. It leads to that anxiety feeling that the game does exceptionally well. Glancer is for sure the most challenging character to learn, so I'm glad he's introduced early into the game so there isn't this absurd difficulty spike later on. The third cutscene we get essentially confirms that Matthew did kill the spy. He put it inside a spare Glancer suit, the same suit that's crawling through the air ducts. In this context, the name Infested Glancer makes a lot more sense, since the body and the suit are probably infested with mites and maggots. Gross. This makes Glancer the Springtrap of the Project Readjusted series, which is fitting since Glancer is one of the original characters. Andrew reasons that since there's very obviously a body in the suit, if he's caught anywhere near it, he could land in jail. With the suit, however, Andrew has more than enough evidence to get Matthew arrested. However, instead of turning in what he's found, he decides to keep quiet in hopes that Matthew will turn up. On the third night, we're introduced to the Wraiths, which are Project Readjusted's version of the Phantoms that everyone loves. There are 3 Wraiths in total, each of them with their own new mechanic. Starting with Wraith Ned, after 8 seconds of being on the camera panel, he will materialize on the screen. Dealing with him is easy as long as you look away immediately. The second Wraith is Vinard, who actually isn't enabled until night 4, but I thought it'd be a lot easier to mention him here alongside the others. Vinard will occasionally make a sound indicating that he's been activated. You can find him in camera 8 staring at the floor. You have to stay on the camera until his eyes look up at the camera, and if you stay too long, I'm sure you can guess what happens. The final Wraith is Finn, a completely new character. Finn is a cat, I believe, and was intended to be a character that would be on stage alongside Buster, almost as a sidekick. Finn's actual existence is debatable considering we never actually see him. His presence is sort of confirmed in PR3, so whether you consider him an actual character or not is up to you. After a short period of time on the monitor, Finn will spawn in one of 3 spots in the office. Hovering the mouse over him will make him go away. If any wraiths were to get to you, they temporarily stun you. Once you regain the ability to move, we'd need to repair the lights on the maintenance side of the air ducts panel. Other than introducing the wraiths, Night 3 feels essentially the same as the previous. In the post-night cutscene, we once again hear from Andrew as he accounts for the previous night's issues. Andrew believes that the wraiths are forming because of toxic fumes in the restaurant's air supply. Andrew also finds a tape that reveals the Glancer suit had constructed itself in the back room. This idea of it seemingly being forming itself from almost nothing goes nowhere, and it's never really brought up again. It's just another case of an interesting detail. Night 4 adds the final character to the game. Well, the final 2 characters if you count Wraith Vinard. Magic Suit is an old character from the Project Adjusted days that now resides in the secondary supply, a room whose camera no longer works. Magic Suit is constrained to the floor by 3 plugs that will slowly lose stability over time. These 3 plugs must be recharged, as losing them will cause a pretty slow but inevitable death. Magic Suit is technically explained on Night 3, but I never really had an issue with him until Night 4 because his plugs barely lose any stability. Magic Suit is another interesting character, as it seems that Mechless is setting him up to be incredibly important, only for him to lose any relevance pretty quickly. There are way too many characters like this. You have Ned, Redeemer, and Vinard from Project Readjusted, and now Glancer and Magic Suit from its sequel. I'm curious if Mechless retconned this much of the story so it'd be easier to follow, and in turn, make games for. As I'm sure you're aware, that's not entirely uncommon because FNAF will do similar things when it introduces new characters. The only difference is that FNAF has had time to let these characters grow and take on their own roles. In Project Readjusted, we have 3 games with a ton of characters and scrapped content. It almost felt as if Mechless was just adding these characters as a means for fan service, but then realized that he could do it better as if adding more characters could do that. I would say that's my one massive gripe with the series. There's not enough time to let things develop. There was a version of the series going forward after PR1, but it's also clear that that wasn't the plan. I think Magic Suit embodies that very idea that plans can change abruptly, and the series can go in a very new direction quickly. Instead of changing or removing characters, they're left in the game. I can see how some would argue that it adds to the charm, but I think it makes the series feel very disjointed in some spots. I love this series for what it's worth, but it seems like a massive oversight. But then again, I guess it could also be material for people to speculate on years later. It was almost as if Mechless wanted someone to cover the series in a massive multi-hour YouTube video. The 5th cutscene sheds a little bit more light on Finn. He was a character that was never finished, but as I mentioned earlier, was meant to accompany Buster on stage. Andrew also notices how its head and hands are missing from the suit, almost as if someone's been trying to dismantle it. The cutscene ends after Andrew makes another remark on how weird the place is. Look, I love Andrew as a character, but I couldn't help but notice that a lot of his oddities are entirely due to the poor writing. I don't get the impression he would actively care this much about a scrapped character while he's looking for his potentially killer friend. Night 5 doesn't add anything new, but serves as the game's unofficial climax in difficulty. I say that pretty loosely, considering that there's 2 more nights arguably harder than this, but for a lot of people, Night 5 is where they stop playing. And yeah, Night 5 is incredibly difficult. A lot of the difficulty comes from the inability to form a reliable gameplay cycle. Since Glancer is incredibly random in how he moves, you can't really plan around him, instead planning around the others and hope that in the time in between is enough to find him and take a guess at where he's headed. Difficulty, more specifically balancing, is something that I've relentlessly preached many times before. It was the basis of my original PR3 video because of how important it is. There should be time for every threat to be dealt with without overlap. Night 5's difficulty feels as if it should be Night 6, which is odd because for the only time in Project Readjusted history is there a 6th night, where I argue there really isn't a need for one, both narratively and logistically. If I were making the game, I think I would make Night 4 a little easier and add a new wraith each night. This is just so the player doesn't feel overwhelmed. Overall, Night 5 is a pretty large step up in difficulty, partly because both Buster and Glancer are at a higher AI than ever, and also because the game up until this point had been a little too easy. In retrospect, Project Readjusted 1 had way better balancing. For my initial playthrough, I only died twice, on nights 4 and 5, and unsurprisingly to Buster since he requires that you plan around him. It never felt unfair at any point, I just knew I had to be a little bit more quicker next time. However, something that PR2 did a lot better was give the game a proper ending. After completing Night 5, we get one more cutscene. It's been 5 days since Andrew started working here. Matthew is still yet to turn up. Suddenly, Andrew hears people outside. The police were tipped off about the Glancer suit, being told that anyone inside the building was responsible. It was a setup by Matthew. Andrew gets arrested, put on trial, is found guilty, and is sentenced to death row in a fairly short period of time. This is the fake ending. Project Readjusted 2 has 2 endings, one fake and one true. The true ending, much like FNAF 3, is pretty complicated, but before we can unlock it, we have to go back for one more night. Return Night, as I mentioned earlier, is the only instance of a 6th night in the entire series, and I would argue that PR2 is the only game in the series that would benefit from not having one. Return Night is a much harder Night 5 in pretty much every aspect. The wraiths are more annoying, and you have to play a lot more conservative than before. Unfortunately, there's not really much to cover on this night because it's essentially an extra, non-canon challenge. It gives an extra menu star and unlocks the extras menu, so while it is technically required, it really serves no greater purpose. The extras menu though is pretty cool. Just like Project Readjusted 1, it gives some valuable insight into how the game was made, the characters, and even scrap builds of earlier versions. We even get some cool cheats and challenges to make the game easier or harder for any replay we may want to do. Before moving on, I want to briefly talk about the custom night, more specifically its max mode, Cake Night. Let me start by saying that Cake Night is incredibly difficult. It is not an easy max mode by any means, and it really comes down to one character. Glancer is by far the single most annoying part of it all. Not only is he way faster than ever before, he's almost at a point where he's so fast it's borderline unfair. So how would you even get consistent enough with Glancer to eventually beat this? It was discovered by someone in the community named Rainbow Hype that Glancer is not entirely random. Let me explain. When Glancer enters the air ducts, his AI will choose which door he's going to come through from the very start. On top of this, Glancer takes only one route for each of the 3 doors. So by watching his first 2 or 3 movements, you can accurately predict which door he's going to be at. There are some automatic tells, like if Glancer starts off by going down instead of up, he'll be at the middle door. Once he's in the top middle section, if he goes further left, he'll be at the right vent, and if he goes down, he'll be at the left. Knowing that Glancer is more pseudo-random right from the start is what makes Cake Night a lot easier. Otherwise, it would more or less play out the same way as Night 6. I wanted to save that discovery until the very end because it's not only when I discovered it, but it's also the most useful here as you may only get 1 or 2 radar uses before having to make a decision. This strategy does work for every night before this as well, which made replaying the game over for the true ending much easier. Speaking of the true ending, it's a bit more complicated. There is only one video that I know of someone who actually gets it on camera, so if it wasn't for JPG Zecker, I probably would not have ever found it. Just like FNAF 3, you're going to have to replay the game from the very beginning. On one of the cameras, the room name text will flicker a little bit. Clicking on the text will briefly show us a vision in the form of an 8-bit minigame before fading out and taking us back to the night. The visions we see range from inside a Buster's restaurant, outside looking at a dumpster, the backstage area, the same dumpster but with a Glancer suit next to it, and finally another look at the dumpster scene, but with Buster there sitting next to Glancer. Doing all of this gives us a new ending. The minigame. It spoke the words I couldn't find myself. Matthew died with his baby. A tape left on him. I can't explain what I've experienced here. I can't go on with this sudden guilt. This damn children's entertainment chain should have never happened. This outcome was not proper, and I can't handle it. I don't know what will happen next. I'll report the death of him and the corpse to the police. At least I can get off with no charges. I can't put myself to do it. I can't go the route my gut wants me to go. It's revealed that shortly after, that same evening, Andrew had a heart attack. The evidence never made its way to the police. After a week, police received complaints from pedestrians. Without making an official statement from the police or any company official, the building would be demolished. Diner World Entertainment closed its doors, with the hope of re-entering the children's entertainment industry someday in another way. This is the true ending. As much as I love to rip on the Project Readjusted series for having pretty much meaningless lore, I have to give credit where credit's due. This ending is very solid, even if it's debatable how much of it is still canon after PR3. But for the time, this was the definitive conclusion. Especially considering there wasn't really any talk of a PR3 ever happening. We know now that even as this game suggests that Andrew's story is complete, we know that's not all the case. I think that perfectly summarizes the main portion of Project Readjusted 2. It's a satisfying game that really brings the story full circle even if there wasn't anything meant to come after it. In retrospect, I don't know if that makes the game better or worse off because of it. However, before we move on to that, there's one last thing I want to talk about. If you remember from earlier, when I was talking about Project Readjusted 2's shop, I mentioned a box. The box is the most expensive item in the shop. It costs 50 tokens to unlock. So for many, it's never justifiable to spend that much on it. But the box is oddly Project Readjusted 2's most interesting piece of side content. When you download PR2 off GameJolt and extract the original zip file, you'll notice two things. First is the actual PR2 exe, and another zip file. This one titled The Box. Attempting to extract the file, however, only results in an error as it's password protected. An odd choice, especially considering that the file itself is almost as big as the main game. Extracting the file is currently out of the picture, but what if you run the file as is? Opening the folder leads to 6 separate executables, each a couple megabytes in size. Running any of these is also out of the question since they're still under the password protection. So what gives? Purchasing the box gives you a code, and inputting the same code into the zip folder unlocks it. So what's truly in the box? No, it's not Matthew's severed head, I thought so too. But extracting the file gives us access to these 6 exe files. All of the files are named content and then a number. These are early builds of Project Readjusted 2. I want to talk about each of these individually because they aren't just separate test builds with the same characters. These are practically 6 new games, each with new characters, environments, and more. So join me as we briefly look at the 6 versions of Project Readjusted 2 that never made it to release. Opening Content 1 presents us with a black screen. In the middle are instructions on what seem to be a bonus night of sorts. Pressing enter to begin the alpha night throws us into this strange office. Definitely one we haven't seen yet. If you took a look at the extras menu in PR2 before opening the box, you'd notice that this is one of the same offices listed in the scrap content section. In fact, all 6 files are those versions. Figuring this out for the first time was a massive surprise, as a lot of developers hide their early game builds from the public. I mean, rightfully so, most of them suck, but in this case, it's really cool. Back to the files, this version of Project Readjusted 2 would have taken place in a Capture the Flag arena as a gimmicky birthday attraction of sorts, with the main portion of the building holding the actual arena and the outskirts being hallways and a break room. There would be 2 entrances into the office, the massive hallway in front of you and another hallway behind you, which you can't see but is conveyed on the map. The way you would defend yourself would have to do with some sort of decoy that you would have to put up on either side of the office. I'm assuming that would also have to do with the 2 cameras on either side of the office. Speaking of which, they have an interesting mechanic. Only one camera can be used at a time, and the way they're activated is by clicking and holding to charge them. These are the only 2 cameras that can be seen directly outside the office. So it's a high risk, high reward for being able to use them properly. As for threats, the game would feature the Bygone animatronics. The group would have included Buster and Ned, but also someone new that goes by the name of SirFiftyFive, who would activate on night 5. It's implied that SirFiftyFive was made by a different company from the ones who made Buster and Ned. That company would eventually go bankrupt and all properties were given to Buster's. The whole deal with the Bygone animatronics is that they've been abandoned for years, so it makes sense why they're all grouped together like this. The word Bygone actually refers to an earlier time. There was supposed to be one more character added, named Morphin. If this version was ever completed, he was supposed to be the only character active on night 7. I think it's safe to assume that Morphin would have been a hybrid of all the Bygone animatronics in the form of some hallucination. He greatly resembles aspects of each of the characters. The head of Buster, ears of Ned, and limbs of SirFiftyFive. As much as hybrid characters have been done to death in recent memory, it's really cool to see how the style would have been interpreted in 2018. And as far as I can remember, this is one of the earliest examples of this. The name Morphin could have also referred to how the characters have morphed into one being, but my interpretation is that the name is actually referring to morphine because no amount of it could have suppressed the absolute pain that this guy would have inflicted. I mean, his character description is just 3 question marks. When have question marks ever represented anything good in FNAF? Anyway, this build was super interesting. It reminds me more of the style that Five Nights at Wario's had, with those super grungy environments mixed with what, assuming were to be placeholders, look to be low poly characters and designs. However, the second build of Project Readjusted 2 is where things get a little bit more interesting. There's an actual character coded. There's a version of Ned that will occasionally wander into the office, where you have to be completely still if you want him to leave. While he is coded, it's inherently clear that there's still more work to do, as my game would crash randomly even if I was completely still the entire time he was in the office. I'm assuming this version of Ned is also Bygone Ned, as he looks almost identical to the one from the first build. This time, the location is in an actual restaurant, the size of which looks to have been scaled down dramatically to accommodate the few animatronics, only featuring a few party rooms, a main area, and a backstage. I mean, it's definitely cool, don't get me wrong, but I think paired with the mechanics, it's easy to see why this game was canned. In the cameras, there are buttons to toggle the camera light, which would also allow you to use a light in the office. I'm only assuming that's what it would have been, but there's no clear indication. It seems as if Mechless also didn't have a clear vision for this mechanic, which isn't great because it's referred to as one of the main mechanics in the synopsis in the extras menu. There's also one more mechanic in the form of a camera connection status, which will slowly deplete. I'm guessing this mechanic works almost the exact same as something like the air duct controls in the first build. Overall, a weird direction for the series, but if there's one thing Mechless learned from this build, it's that he wanted Project Readjusted 2 to be dark. For sure visually, but somewhat thematically. Content 3 is a smaller build, but easily the most interesting so far. This version of Project Readjusted 2 would have taken place in a warehouse of sorts and would feature a threat that really isn't an animatronic. The player would be sanctioned in the back of the warehouse, monitoring the outside of the building for possible intruders. If one is spotted, the player is instructed to call 911 to have them dealt with. I don't know who or what could be outside trying to get into a warehouse, but someone clearly important to the story. This concept is interesting by itself, and it's even more interesting to see how in retrospect this would have been sort of retconned in Project Readjusted 3. But I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth soon. Something else that I found out a little later is that the only actual threat in this version of PR2 would have been Cable Buster, who finally makes his first appearance. There would actually be multiple busters that you could lure around. Not jumping to any conclusions or assumptions, but it would have been really cool if you could sick Buster on one of the intruders if the phone line went dead or something. The fourth variant of Project Readjusted 2 is surprisingly more complete than the last 3, which is interesting because according to the extras menu in the final PR2, it's regarded as the first build, being traced back to as early as 2017. Only the menu and some of the basic office functions were ever finished, but even so, there's still a lot to cover, especially on this menu. I love how Buster looks at whatever button the player has their mouse over. While the menu is mostly finished, the only button that actually works is the button to start a new game. Immediately after loading into the office, it's obvious that even super early into development, Mechless wanted the game to be as dim as possible, and I don't think anything demonstrates that better than its office. It's so dark, and you feel the impact right away. This version of Project Readjusted 2 takes place in an abandoned daycare. Wait, where have I seen this one before? Jokes aside, this environment is incredible, even if it is a little hard to believe that this is actually an abandoned daycare and not just some underground research facility. And to think that this was modeled and constructed in 2017, a time where very few games could replicate an environment that detailed, is unbelievable. I mean, you have everything from the wires to the ambient lighting, and to think that this never saw the light of day is a little odd. I think this would have been extremely popular given the time period. Even compared to the office in the final version of PR2, it feels like a considerable upgrade in ambience. That's of course not to say that the version we have is bad, but it surely feels underwhelming compared to this. While we're in the office, we can look left to what is presumably a hallway, and how one could ever argue that this is one point a daycare is beyond me. I mean, this is more resemblant to Outlast. You can also turn to the right wall in the office, and by clicking you can enter a safe room. This concept is really cool, and I've only seen it done ever in Five Nights at Wario's 2. Nothing can be done in the room, so I would assume the mechanic that's tied to it would have been something to do with waiting out a character. Going back to the main area, there's 2 panels. One that hasn't been coded, which I would only assume to be a camera system. The other panel is surprisingly functional. It's called the config mainframe, and is used to control all the moving parts. The main component is the temperature manager, where you can change the building's temperature to pretty much anything. There's a warning below it that says if the temperature is below 65 degrees or above 85 degrees, an emergency alarm will trigger. I'm assuming that there would have been a character that would require the temperature to be either extremely high or low, and the only way to get rid of them would have to trigger an alarm, potentially triggering someone else. It's for sure a unique idea, even if I don't have the best idea of how it would be implemented. At the bottom is a space to purchase upgrades to your equipment, such as better Wi-Fi and a faster cooldown. All of the upgrades cost money, so I'm assuming that there would have been a currency system similar to the final version. Overall, the fourth file is super interesting to see. I don't think that a game like Project Readjusted would have gone in a direction like this, especially considering how the first game ended. The fifth file is another surprisingly competent early build. This time, red is the primary color used, and it's paired nicely with a new character on the menu. I'm unsure as to who this is, but from what I can gather, it seems to be another early version of Cable Buster, or this new character called Scrapster, which seems to be Project Readjusted's Springtrap equivalent before Infested Glancer. From the extras menu in PR2, it's revealed that even though this version of the game was short-lived, there was a working AI. Exactly who it was is unknown, because from my playthrough and looking at others online, no one can get it to activate. However, we do know how two of the characters would work. Buster would wander around like normal and eventually end up at the door on the right side of the office. We then have to pull a lever that activates this decoy, which is essentially an animatronic on a stick that's used as a door. Magic Suit would also be a part of this build, and they would behave similar to Buster, except we'd have to use a jammer to stop them when we see them in the cameras. The jammer itself is hooked up to this panel on the far right of the office. It allows us to jam any camera that we input, which would seemingly deal with Magic Suit as well as potentially freeze anyone else that was in the same room. At the bottom, there's a section to enter a staff exit key. I'm assuming this would have been the objective of each night, having to either complete a certain task and only being allowed to clock out once it's been completed and we obtain the staff key. I actually like this idea a lot. As you'll come to see when we talk about PR3 and its task-based system, the night ends almost immediately after you finish the task, but adding a whole other thing to do on top of that would have created some pretty intense situations. The final build is the most akin to the original Project Readjusted. We are back at another Buster's location, one that I would assume is very close in design and structure. The office is a bit bigger than the original, but it feels more run down and thrown together, almost as if it was an abandoned room that was quickly constructed to make an office, similar to the original. The parallels between the two are very noticeable here, much more than ever, which I really have come to appreciate. Over on the left side, there's a camera panel that shows a general layout of the building. It's definitely bigger than before, the shape reminding me of a large circuit with branching paths every so often. From the extras menu description, it's revealed that the gameplay in this version was slower paced, which was the main reason for its eventual cancellation. We also get a small glimpse of some of the mechanics: a pulse level, a light projection setting, security light fixtures that could be activated, and finally a denoise function. The latter to all of those being the only one coded into the build. It works almost identical to the light switch in Flumpty's 2, where once pressed, the lights go out, but so does all of your systems. It's revealed in the synopsis that this would give some time for a character to leave. What is never mentioned anywhere is who would actually have starred in this version. My guess is a new version of the Project Readjusted cast, alongside with some old Wither characters, building off this FNAF 2 feel. That's really it for this build, and the box as a whole for that matter. This was by far my favorite addition onto a Project Readjusted game. I don't think I needed to cover this, but I'm glad I did, because seeing where the series was headed at certain points in time was really cool. And besides, a lot of these characters return in an old build of Project Readjusted 3. Speaking of, in late August of 2020, Five Nights at Freddy's creator Scott Cawthon would take to Reddit to announce what he called the Fazbear Fanverse Initiative, a program that he was starting to directly fund and license fan games as official FNAF products. This was a huge deal for the community. Along with this announcement, Scott Cawthon would confirm 5 new games to be developed by some of the community's largest figures. Mechless heard about the news and decided to announce a new project of his own, Project Readjusted 3. Being a year and a half since the release of Project Readjusted 2, Mechless had allegedly hated the development process, lamenting how it was the bane of his existence. Which is fair enough, honestly. If I were to make 14 variants of what was narratively the same game, I would go insane too. But now with his new motivation and painful learning experience behind him, he was ready to start anew. The version of Project Readjusted 3 that Mechless would begin work on was much different from the final version. The only reason I'm going to go into this much detail about another scrapped version is because this was closer to completion than any of the scrapped PR2 builds. When Mechless started work on PR3 sometime around August 2020, this version of the game was not only thematically different, but most likely was a complete departure from the story that he had built up. While this can't be confirmed at the moment, from what was shown, it's hard to connect the former games to this. The elevator version of Project Readjusted 3, at least from what we can see from the promotional material online and the working file that we'd later get, was supposed to take large inspiration from UCN. While that most likely wasn't the full intention, because a full main campaign was planned, it's what we see from the latest build, so it's presumably what the game became after a while. The elevator version features almost every single character from every version of Project Readjusted. This not only includes almost every character from the Scrap PR2 builds, but also a ton of new characters. The two main characters that I want to direct your attention to, Subject and Subjected Buster, were supposed to carry this game's story, but since this version's cancellation, they fell out of relevancy. There's also a couple of characters from other games Mechless was working on, most notably Honeybear from Honeybear's Fantasy and the Baby Geist from Baby's Nightmare Circus. I'm really not sure how they would have fit into the game's story, but I'm sure they were probably custom-made exclusives. From the build we got, the game would have been very customizable. The main objective is never shown, but the main premise is that we're sanctioned in an elevator. Presumably, it would go further down in the building during the night and introduce new characters, but that's all up to speculation. Depending on who you added into the night, they'd make your way towards you through a map that you would create yourself, choosing where the different rooms are, which hallways connect, and where each character starts. The idea itself is extremely promising, and from what I've played, that's very apparent. Each character has their own stats and specs that make them all different. To accompany this is a difficulty meter on the side of the main screen, allowing you to control how difficult you want the night to be. Everything in this build showcases how well something similar to this would have been. That's not to say that this in itself is perfect, far from it. As development on the elevator version continued, Mechless would begin to experience a recurring problem. He would get too many ideas, and when trying to implement them, he'd experience some issue with functionality. This would cause Mechless to completely scrap the elevator version of Project Readjusted 3 in favor of the glowstick version, which he'd actually started before committing to the elevator version. It's a shame to see all this hard work being scrapped, especially since a good portion of renders were complete. I wonder if someone will take what Mechless started and finish it, considering that almost all of the materials are available, but who knows. Regardless, this is probably one of my favorite pieces of Project Readjusted history. Before we move on, there was one more project that Mechless was working on behind the scenes before finishing Project Readjusted 3. Growing tired of massive fan games that take too long and are too ambitious, Mechless set his sights on something much smaller in scope, but could still hook his audience. The Project Readjusted remake is a remake of a remake, and a complete overhaul at that too. While we don't have nearly as much information on this game as we do some of the other scrap projects from this time, we have a post, multiple screenshots, and a couple of videos. The remake was probably started because, well, Project Readjusted kinda sucks. Like, no offense, and I still stand by everything I said in that portion of the video, but compared to Project Readjusted 3, it's not very good. This remake would have also allowed for the story to be refined to fit with a new entry. So, with a couple of reasons for this to exist, let's take a look at what would have been changed. First and foremost, the game is much more appealing visually. It doesn't hurt to look at anymore, which is always nice. The building also looks to have been overhauled, not looking stale and unlived in, but rather a pretty convincing rendition of a restaurant with the same style from that time frame. From the video we get of the office gameplay, the building layout was also massively cut down. This is a change I'm all for, since the original Project Readjusted had way too many rooms and didn't use very many of them. But now with only 5 rooms, not including the office, there's practically a use for each of them. It's not like the reduction in cameras is at all a compromise either. Like I touched on earlier, it feels more realistic that way. I mean, think about it, in a real restaurant akin to those of Chuck E. Cheese's, there's one large open area with a couple of extra rooms surrounding those for storage, kitchen, repairs, whatever. This new layout resembles that greatly. Let's talk about characters for a quick moment. There's still only 6 characters, but without Vinard, thank God. Glancy has been separated to become new versions of both Glancer and Glossy. This is an extremely welcome change. I personally despised Vinard from the start. He almost has like no lore relevance and was just too different from the other characters to make any logical sense. Like, why was he there? Vinard has absolutely zero reason to exist except for the fact that he has a chip. Which makes me wonder, who would have gotten it instead? My bet is on Redeemer, but I wouldn't be too surprised if it also went to Ned, since his new model is a million times better and I would love for him to have more importance. Sadly, just like most projects so far, Mechless' expectations far exceeded what he was willing to put in, and promptly cancelled the game. However, there have been talks of other developers reviving the remake, so maybe sometime soon this version will see the light of day. Since my original video in April 2022, a lot has changed. A major content update has been released, including a new max mode, a new ending, a literal online multiplayer game, and many more improvements. For my playthrough, I played through the most recent patch, version 3.5.7. Although I don't think this game will receive any more content past this patch, that's also what I felt 2 years ago, and yet here we are. I wanted to re-review the game a few months after my first video in August, to coincide with the release of 3.0, I eventually scrapped that idea since it felt like I was regurgitating the same points I made in my original video. Now, with the background knowledge of the previous 3 games, the scrapped remake and main series entries, I think I'm ready to take the full walk into Project Readjusted 3. However, we need to do this a little differently. Project Readjusted 3 was more or less the series' curtain call. This game has 3 versions, each fundamentally similar but with minor changes. You have version 1, which was more or less the bare bones version of PR3, all the essential components and story, but lacking much polish. Then, a year later, you have version 2, the version I played when I made my video. And then finally, you have version 3, which was released last August and serves as a way to conclude the series as we know it, removing any potential teaser material that would have been briefly used for future projects. For every game in this video, I've played on the newest patch and briefly mentioned earlier patches, such as how I described PR1's legacy build. For this section specifically, I will be referring to PR3's version 2 build on its latest patch, version 2.1.2. This is entirely because this build was the definitive version of Project Readjusted 3 for a while, and so much of what comes next for this series is directly tied to this version. I want to talk about version 3 in greater detail later on, since there are a couple of differences. I hope that's not too confusing. Where we left off, Mechla switched back to the glowstick version of Project Readjusted 3, which was less complex and more rooted in its origin than the elevator version. Development went smoother than before, and the game was finished within 3 months after returning to glowstick. Not much was said between the Switch and the release window announcement. While we don't know what the broader Project Readjusted fanbase was thinking or expecting, we know that not as much hype was present when the game was released on the 5th of November 2021. This was the basis of my original video. This game was incredible and no one was talking about it. I remember dying on night 2 and going to YouTube to look up a tutorial when I found that no one had made a single video on it. I played it in February, 4 months after the game was released, and still nothing. So that's why this game, at least in my heart, is forever underrated. Okay, enough about the introduction, I want to talk about the game already. Upon opening the game, you'll load into the main menu. In the background, a more rundown looking area can be seen with a rabbit head scribbled on the wall. Its third eye opened, and the word "us" is written multiple times around it, almost as if the rabbit head is a symbol of knowledge that can only be obtained if you're one of them. On the wall in the back, some masks can be seen hanging. These masks look exactly like the rabbit head drawn on the wall. You're immediately hit with this incredible score composed by FFsky. I mentioned this in my original PR3 video, but I firmly believe that the soundtrack in this game is the best Fangame soundtrack and what makes the game as ambient and dystopian as it is. This entire menu screen is incredible. It perfectly sets up the feeling of the game. The game opens on a cutscene with a mysterious voice calling us out by name, claiming they know who we are and where our intentions lie. The eerie voice tells us that they can provide us with the information that we want on Matthew, still missing, and Andrew, the protagonist, who's still searching for anything that could lead him to a definitive conclusion. The voice provides us with an ultimatum. His image similarly appears on the screen to the cutscenes in the previous games, but this time more scratches are on the side of the image. While this could be a stylistic choice, I believe it represents Andrew's desperation to finish the story, or at least to forget what happened and move on. The images seem to be drawings based on Andrew's memories of his experiences in between game sections. It feels as if he's using these depictions to tie everything he knows together, only as he continues, he begins to lose sight of what he's really after and becomes too focused on just the important details. It's also more than possible that the scratches could be prefacing what's to come later in the game, almost like he's trying to forget what happened. I could again just be looking way too deeply into this, but honestly doing so is my favorite part of this franchise because it actually allows you to do this. You may have also noticed that the voice, or more so person, is wearing a rabbit mask to conceal their identity. The mask is similar to the drawing depicted on the menu, although right now it's unclear what purpose the mask serves. The voice's ultimatum is simple: keep 3 people he's holding captive alive for 5 days. These people are full of knowledge on Matthew and have agreed to tell us as long as we play along with his game, where whoever remains alive will be released. It's also important to mention that the voice switches from referring to himself to referring to himself as an us, implying that there's more people just like him that he's working with. Right now, these people aren't identified, but I think that the notion that there are more people involved in this admittedly sick game is beyond horrifying. The first night begins and we seem to be in a rundown repair shop, its age showing, as droplets of water hit the floor and echo throughout. A dense fog of darkness surrounds the player, only giving light to anything within a couple of feet. After a couple of seconds, the intercom buzzes and we finally hear the voice. He explains the basics to survival in the game, as well as how to use the tools around us. We're told that the 3 captives are held in separate rooms upstairs above us. They will survive as long as we listen to their exact instructions. The voice instructs us to open the tablet in front of us. There are 2 sections to the tablet, the security and supply modules. The voice tells us that the most important thing to focus on is the supply module. The 3 patients upstairs are locked in their rooms without food and water, and it is our job to supply them. We can send supplies to the 3 patients. Each of the 3 white squares represent a room in which supplies can be sent to. These squares can also be clicked on to change which room is getting supplies, further indicating by the arrow in the middle room. The voice reinforces that each of the white squares is also a form of life that we must do everything in our power to protect. Some odd wording for sure, considering all we're doing right now is just giving them food, but I digress. The voice then finishes by explaining the rest of the supply module. Opening the gate will send 1 box of supplies to whichever room the arrow in the middle is pointing towards. Only 1 box of supplies can be sent at a time, which also means that you can only help 1 person until they receive their supply, and then a new box can be sent out. The boxes that are sent out can either be yellow, indicating food, or blue, indicating water. There's no real pattern to what type of supply is being sent out. Some players have opted to send as many supplies to a given patient until they're entirely fed. This strategy is for the most part pretty hands-off, but it requires more materials since a patient could get more of one material than the other. The other strategy I've seen is meticulously divvying out the supplies to whoever needs them. This is much more involved, but it's more material conservative, which is what I opted to do because I found that getting more material was a much more involved process than switching to who gets material every so often. Speaking of, at the start of each night we're given a set amount of supply as well as a maximum capacity of supply we can have on hand. In the middle is a short minigame that can be played to earn supplies. This varies from update to update, but in our case, we need to slide the slider over the gray zone that is constantly moving around. If we can do this for about a second, 1 supply will be added to our inventory. I think my favorite part of this mechanic, at least for the time being, is how the conveyor and minigame work with each other. If the conveyor is running and materials are being sent out, the minigame can't be played, so ordering new materials requires you to stop the conveyor entirely. There's a reason why I love this mechanic so much, but I'll have to get back on that in a little while. There's one more part to the task-based system. The average amount of food and water that each patient has is calculated into a satisfaction meter. The average of all 3 satisfaction meters determines your grade. It will go up when the satisfaction goes up, but this is only important because it's this grading-based system that allows you to complete a night. In the bottom left, you'll see your current grade out of the minimum required grade to complete each night. You will always start off with an F, and you can work your way up to an S, which is the highest grade. This requires you to have all patients with maximum food and water at one time, which can be much harder than you'd think. Once you've achieved the minimum grade, the finished button will become available in the upper right hand side of the camera panel. Clicking it allows you to end your duties for the night, since the patients can survive on their own until tomorrow. After each night, you'll load into a small minigame that tells a different story. We're still playing as Andrew, but when he used to work at Buster's. In this minigame, the restaurant has finally reopened with animatronic entertainers. Andrew mentions how his boss made it very clear to him that he needs to hold these robots with high regard, and that Andrew needs to keep a close eye on them. We head towards the stage to check on them, but as we do, we notice slips of paper on the floor. They warn us about a lockdown protocol, and how all animatronics need to be taken off stage an hour before the protocol goes into place. As Andrew approaches the stage, he realizes that one of the characters must have already been taken backstage early. We go to verify this, but as we enter the room, we notice a kid lying on the floor, twitching, blood everywhere. A disturbing sight for sure, but the minigame ends before we can figure out any more. As we head back to the menu, we're told that we've unlocked the patient hub. As it turns out, you can actually visit the 3 patients and personally talk with them to see how they're doing. However, they understandably don't want anything to do with Andrew, since he is the reason they're here. The patient hub serves as an interactive place where all of your collectibles and information will be stored. While we don't have anything right at the moment, this room soon becomes crowded with all sorts of things that we can find. With nothing else to do besides return for a second night, we're back in the worst place on Earth. The intercom buzzes once again, and the voice returns to give us some updated instructions. He says that a small catch that's related to Matthew will be with us here on out. An animatronic that he created is with us as another challenge to overcome. This is where we are finally introduced to Busted, my personal favorite character in the entire series. Busted will roam around the building, always in one of the 3 cameras. He'll change rooms frequently, but once he can't be found in any of them, he's found you instead. The voice warns us that when this happens, we need to act quick if we want to survive. He's provided us with a glow stick, which is the only tool at our disposal, and the only one that will save our life. I've said this before and I'll say it again, the way the glow stick is revealed to us is nothing short of perfection. Prior to tonight, there was no real reason for us to flip down the camera. Even so, I and many other players did. There's this beautiful amount of uncertainty and anxiety that builds up over the span of the first night. In fact, any FNAF player should know that having the camera up for an extended period of time is just asking for trouble. So flipping it down every once in a while to observe the cold ambience of the office is very normal, but now with the glow stick, we can give light to the area. And what a gross little space this is. If you haven't already pieced together, thanks to the bunny mask scribbled on the wall, this is the same room as the one on the main menu. It's a neat little reveal mixed in with some lore foreshadowing later on. In the office, there are 4 separate entrances, 2 on the far sides and 2 in the middle. When Busted can no longer be found on any of the cameras, it's safe to assume that he's standing in one of these entrances. Using the glow stick and hovering it around him will be enough to send him back into the darkness. The glow stick does have a limited use though, so while it can be very effective against Busted, it's also very useless once that small use period has expired. It will recharge over time, but it's much slower if you've drained it fully, so it's best to avoid doing that. The voice tells us that Busted has one more trick up his metal sleeve. So, as it turns out, the 3 cameras in our security feed all have doors in sight. These are the rooms where the patients are being kept during the night. They're put so far away from us to prevent us from harming them. However, they are conveniently close to where Busted wanders around. I sure hope nothing unfortunate comes from that. Oh my god. So, as it turns out, in an incredibly disturbing way, Busted can kill a patient. This is the first time that I can think of where it's not only our life on the line, but also the lives of people we're surrounded by. Project Readjusted 3 went very quickly from this game about surviving 5 nights and getting evidence, to surviving while also keeping others alive with you. Even if you have no morals or argue that they don't need to be saved because they're nameless, they still have evidence that you need, so keeping them alive is within our best interest. The voice tells us that we have to pay extra close attention to the camera that Busted is in. If we see him near one of the doors where a patient is in, we have to ring the bell on our desk. This will spare the patient for now, but put ourselves in immediate danger. Busted will immediately make his way to us, and the same way we learned how to get rid of him before still applies. The bell is interesting because it's an almost foolproof way of getting Busted in the office. That may sound weird, but it's actually great. Too busy ordering more supplies and now you've lost track of Busted? Ring the bell. However, just like every tool in the game, it can also be a handicap. The bell only works if Busted isn't already in the room with us. Ringing it while he's with us is an insta-kill, so finding time to get him into the office is important. The other characters will soon be added work in conjunction with the bell, so while it can be a multi-use tool, it's mostly effective with Busted. Night 2 for the most part is decently straightforward. A little side tangent, but on my very first playthrough of the game over 2 years ago, I wasn't paying attention during the intercom speech, and I proceeded to die about 5 times. In confusion, I tried to look up a walkthrough online, when I realized that no one on YouTube had even given the game a chance. So if Busted wasn't as complex as he was, I would have likely never died, and would never know that this game is so underrated. I wouldn't have made my original video, and I wouldn't be up at 2:30 on a Saturday morning writing this exact video. After finishing our shift, we load back into the same minigame from the previous night right where it left off. The kid is fine, but Andrew realizes that the animatronics in this restaurant are very similar to the previous locations. Rumors were spreading of how dangerous and unsafe they were. As Andrew leaves the backstage area to tell the other employees what he's found, he notices a large circle of workers up by the stage. Another child was injured, and this one is pretty bad. The entire building staff is understandably panicked, and they mention how a large crowd is formed outside the restaurant. We're instructed to check the office to make sure everything's still intact after the restaurant went into panic. Everything in the office seems normal, but just as Andrew leaves the room, he notices a purple figure in the hallway. The minigame cuts out before we get a good look at it. Checking back in with the patients, and they're seeming to accept the reality of their situation. One of the patients mentions how the building we've been in is directly below the building we used to work at, the one with the fume problems. Another accounts that they've heard screaming throughout the night, and the final patient recalls seeing a purple figure approach her, but looking directly at it made it vanish. She also mentions that they're being a leader of the group responsible for her kidnapping. It's mentioned how he's super strict and controlling, making sure that everything's going to plan. Weird for sure, but since everything is fine here, we have no other option than to go back for a 3rd night. When we arrive back in the office, the mysterious voice comes back over the intercom to tell us that this will be their final interaction with us until we've completed the game. He mentions that the building we're currently in is directly below the Project Readjusted 2 building. It still has its fume problems, only now they're seeping into the downstairs area, exactly where we are. I remember my first time playing through this game and having my mind blown by that revelation, not even knowing of Project Readjusted 2 that much. I mean, it's not like Andrew didn't know where he was, but the way it's revealed to us as the player, that in my opinion makes it that much more impactful. Project Readjusted 3 does that a lot, finding subtle ways to reveal massive details about either the story, its gameplay, or, in this case, its environment. Anyway, the voice tells us that because we're in the basement of the abandoned storage facility, we share its fumes. If you remember from PR2, the fumes are what create the Wraith animatronics. They make a return for PR3, but they've been tweaked quite a bit. Now there's only 2 of them, Wraith Buster and Finn. They work almost exactly the same as they did in PR2, only now that one of them is in the cameras and the other is in the office. They also can no longer jumpscare the player on their own, which is nice, but they're still just as important to deal with as the main threats. Over the course of a night, Wraith Buster will begin to materialize in the office. A quiet heartbeat can be heard indicating that he's spawning. We must lower the camera and use the glow stick in the office to scare him away. Wraith Finn, on the other hand, will also begin to materialize over time. The same heartbeat sound cue can be heard on the cameras. Wraith Finn will spawn in one of the 3 cameras, a large purple hue taking over the majority. Leaving the camera panel up and on that specific camera is the only way to get rid of him. If we fail to get rid of either of the Wraiths, then there's a chance for them to spawn in one of the patient's rooms, which will cause them to scream. If they scream, Busted would immediately find them and try to get in. Only a small window of time remains to ring the bell and save a life. The post-night minigame once again resumes from where we left off. Andrew acknowledges the figure as a hallucination of the Finn character, which I guess confirms his existence. I was wrong to deny it back during PR2. Andrew brushes it off and has to check in with his coworkers to let them know that the office is clear. We are finally allowed to leave the building for the day and go home. The minigame fades away as we leave. Night 3's minigame is pretty straightforward compared to previous nights, and that's by design. I'll talk about that in a little while, but right now the patients are finally starting to warm up to Andrew. They aren't entirely trusting of him just yet, but they are starting to drop some subtle gameplay tips, like how we can ring the bell in the office to lure Busted towards us. However, one of them reveals that their sister worked on constructing the animatronics and heard her reading some blueprints aloud. That's all we get for now, but these patients continue to remind us that they are real people too, and that our actions do have consequences that extend past our own life. Night 4 is really interesting in the way that nothing really happens. There isn't an intercom announcement from the mysterious voice, nor is there a new threat. It's simply Busted, the Wraiths, and keeping the patients alive. I do like how we're given some downtime here, which definitely makes adjusting to the new mechanics at a lot higher difficulty much easier. I'm not going to ramble too much about this night because, again, nothing interesting happens. What is interesting is the minigame that takes place directly after our shift. We don't play as Andrew, but instead as the Wraith that Andrew saw at the end of the second night. This is further confirmed by the minigame's purple hue and faster soundtrack. We aren't supposed to be here. The minigame seems corrupt. There's countless glitches and sprites of children and employees blocking the halls. After wandering around for a little while, we enter a room with another injured child laying on the ground twitching. As we approach the child, some text box opens up on the screen saying, "You can be restored. I can do that for you. You must kill them for me. Trespasser." Before getting too close, the minigame ends. Back in the patient hub, one of the patients tells us that they heard someone debugging an animatronic upstairs last night. They say that the person was altering the mascot's code because he had a similar experience when their sister brought home a pink robot. They tried fixing it, but to no avail. Another patient accounts for hearing rumbling noises outside the building during the night. Anytime an alarm would go off, they would scamper away. Without a doubt the weirdest thing we've heard so far, but I guess that should be normal by now. Heading back into the office for the final night, and nothing seems different. After about 20 seconds, the intercom comes back online.
Animatronic performer model patch 3A 2001 signal detected and active. Report protocol locked. Please refrain contact with model patch 3A. Notes from author. No staring. Use noise to push away. Repeat. No staring. Use noise to push away.
Just like that, we have another animatronic to deal with. This is subject model number 3A, arguably the most important character. I know I've said that about 4 times already, but this time I mean it. I'll talk about them in depth a little later, but I first want to talk about how they're dealt with. 3A will be in one of the 3 cameras at all times. If you happen to be on the same camera as them, they'll reach out their hand to disable it. 3A breaking a camera is very bad for a multitude of reasons, including the fact that it's disabled for 30 seconds. Within that 30 seconds, Busted has an increased chance of attacking that patient associated with that camera, so it's best to avoid looking in the same camera for too long. Occasionally, 3A will leave the cameras and end up in your office. His loud metal clanking sounds indicate his arrival. Only by immediately ringing the bell will ward him off. Doing literally anything else before he leaves will result in you being killed. 3A is not someone to mess around with. He's the only addition to Night 5 and serves as an unofficial boss of sorts. We'll talk about 3A again shortly, but after finishing the night, we load into one final minigame. We're playing as a child, the minigame still glitching out as a text box appears on screen. They made it. This is the kid from the Night 1 minigame, presumably dead or at least in an unconscious state. We make our way into the back room where everything happened. We talk with who is presumably Wraith Finn, their head on a table. They tell us that they didn't mean to harm us. It wasn't their goal, only to make people scream. The true threats are those lurking the halls at night. Wraith Finn tells us that we've succeeded in our mission, and the patients are now free. The minigame ends before we can learn any more. Alright, I know that this is confusing, and I want to take a minute to explain what just happened. We are presumably talking to whatever spirit resides inside Finn, presumably a child that had died while at Buster's. The Wraiths don't want to hurt anyone, they're just following orders, those given to the actual animatronics. However, they just want to leave everything behind. I'll admit, this is the one part of the Project Readjusted story that's confused me. It's never explicitly mentioned anywhere that there were murders happening inside the restaurants, or even that there was an accidental death. After the minigame ends, we get to witness the ending. All patients have been freed, but the mysterious voice implies that there was more that we could have done instead, to help better our case. That's right, there's multiple endings. Playing through the game from the very start, we can start to piece together how to get the true ending. In each minigame, walking around the perimeter of the building, you may eventually stumble into a wall. Going through and following this invisible maze will lead you to a note. The notes will vary from each night, but they tell a different story. The first note tells us about the HICM, or Hyper Intelligent Computing Membrane, a giant computer that's used to control every and all robots ever produced by Diner World Entertainment, the creators of Buster's. The computer is well hidden, and an ex-employee tries to find it. The second note tells us about how the HICM will overheat and cause some of the robots attached to it to malfunction. One of the robots that was being tested seemingly left the building entirely, not to be seen again. The third note tells us that subject model number 3A has failed numerous testing checkpoints and is currently being assessed. It's also mentioned that test audiences did not like his appearance too much and were put off by him. 2 other new entertainers are currently being tested. The fourth is a clipping of a newspaper, where photos of a mysterious robot roaming the woods have been seen, but disappears quickly once the loud noises are present. The article was actually written by none other than Hayden, the protagonist in Project Readjusted 1, so I'm glad to see that he's still doing well for himself. The final note is titled My Whereabouts, so it's no surprise that it was written by Matthew. He's moved on, his plans with the HICM are complete. He's just now setting up the very game we just played. I'll explain a little bit more in depth about what the HICM is and why it's so important, but for now, all you need to know is that it's what's making Busted and 3A so aggressive. The 5 notes scattered in each of the 5 minigames are what is required to get the true ending. However, there is one more thing. On night 3, taking the true ending, a new character will be added. A human, wearing a white suit and covering his face with a rabbit mask. This is the Subjected member, one of my personal favorite characters. Occasionally, throughout the night, he'll step into the office to see how you're doing. It's revealed through this that the Subjected member is the mysterious voice on the intercom, and the one who got Andrew involved in the first place. The name Subjected member implies that there's more than one of them. Subjected member is one of the hardest characters to incorporate into a night than any other before. He'll occasionally appear in one of the cameras. Once you either change a camera or put down the console altogether, he'll enter the office. When he enters, you need to keep the camera panel up and the conveyor running the entire time he's in the office, or he'll kill you. The subjects don a rabbit mask, the same as the one on the wall in front of us in the office. The choice of a rabbit always confused me, as there isn't a rabbit character in the Project Readjusted series. The rabbit could be a symbol for many things. In the Chinese zodiac, the rabbit symbolizes mercy and intelligence. Mercy is given to the patients in the form of us, someone that the subjected brought in, but every night saves them from the horrors that lurk in the dark. The intelligence portion is a little bit more evident as the rabbit described on the wall has its third eye open, referring to how they seem to have infinite knowledge on anything that Andrew could ever want. It could also have nothing to do with religion or outside beliefs. The term "follow the white rabbit" means to follow a strange idea or situation wherever it takes you, even if the destination is unclear. We see this symbolism throughout the game. Ever so desperate for information, Andrew will follow any lead, even if it leads him and other people into countless life or death situations. It's revealed through clever wording throughout the notes that the subjected member is Matthew, ever so carefully keeping an eye on Andrew, making sure he never gets close enough to find the truth. It's a beautiful setup and execution, and one that I wasn't fully expecting. One thing is for sure though, the subjected is a cult. Their leader Matthew and their god this rabbit. And then it hit me, their leader isn't this mysterious rabbit, it's subject model number 3A, who just so happens to be a rabbit animatronic, albeit a pretty fucked up rabbit. 3A has a lot of importance in the Project Readjusted story because he's the first animatronic created by Diner World Entertainment. He's the reason that every and all animatronic were made and for the creation of the HICM. It's also likely that this is why Matthew wanted to work for Diner World in the first place. There's not much known beyond that, but that's okay, because we've taken the full walk now. We found Matthew. Well, found is a little generous because he gets away in the end, but still. The patients are for sure set free by now and can tell us what they know. The information the patients tell us are small anecdotes of working for Dino World. These range from working on Glossy to straight up kidnappings, but they're all interesting. I'm not going to summarize them because I still want you to play this game, even if I have spoiled all of it. It's seriously worth playing the game and piecing small bits of the story together, trust me. Other than some minor post-game content, like a full-on multiplayer hide-and-seek type game, not even joking by the way, that's all there is to Project Readjusted 3. This is my favorite fan game of all time, and it will probably stay that way forever. Unless Jolly 4 decides to release, which it won't. Who am I kidding, this is probably still better. I want to leave this section off here, because I still want you to play through the game and find all these small secrets for yourself. I'm going to leave a link in the description for my good friend Dice Game's 100% PR3 walkthrough, if you're at all stuck or lame and won't play the game for yourself. Before we move on, we need to talk about arguably the most important event regarding the Project Readjusted series. In early June of 2022, Restless, alongside two very prominent FNAF developers, were exposed for owning and contributing to a group chat. The group chat contained several leaks of upcoming FNAF projects and sensitive personal information of members in the community. This was a massive blow to a large portion of the community, especially since two of the members in the group chat had yet to release their games, one of which was rumored to be included into the fanverse. What I can even say in this small section of a large video will never do justice to the amount of damage that was caused in what seemed like an instant. His name and any credibility he had established was ruined. Just as quickly as it happened, everyone forgot about Project Readjusted, or at least tried to burn it out of their memories. Since then, anytime Project Readjusted is brought up with anyone more involved in the community, it's often not on the game's quality, but instead how its developer is one of the scummiest people ever. I'm well aware that this feels like it's coming out of left field to praise these games as much as I have and then immediately drop this. I can't even imagine how random this would feel if you had no clue what this series was and who the people involved were until watching this video. But at the same time, how else would I go about doing so? I couldn't just start this video off with a disclaimer. I feel like that would turn a lot of people off. And I can't just ignore this entirely. That would just be disingenuous to not only you, but also the people affected. Because of this event, I was on and off about making this video, since calling a series underrated implies that it's worth your attention. I don't want to paint Restless as this perfect image because that's very obviously not the case. I also don't want to make him out as this awful person. I want this point of the video to serve as a reminder for what happened going forward. Choose to support him or not, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to continue this on because there is still a lot of content to cover. Up until this point, this video has been in mostly chronological order, but we're going to take a moment to look back a couple of months. In late February 2022, about a month after PR3 version 2.0 released, and 4 months before Restless was outed, Project Readjusted 3 would be updated to version 2.1.1, which was a fairly minor update, but it fixed a secret only unlocked for 100%ing the game to be attainable. Going into the patient hub, a child can be found standing in the middle of the room. A strange place for them for sure, but at this point it's like the least weird thing about this game. However, when you actually talk to the child, something isn't right. They talk in third person, and it's almost immediately obvious that they aren't talking to Andrew, but instead, they're talking to you, the player. The child is what I would assume to be a stand-in for Restless. It's how he envisions himself in this world he's created. Not someone who can control what the player does, but only someone that can observe, like any of the children in the minigames. Someone who doesn't expect the player to have taken the full walk, but instead surprised that you've stuck around until the end. Restless knows that very few people would actually do that, and it's one of the main reasons I love Project Readjusted 3 so much. It feels personal. I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but it feels as if the game was truly made for the completionists, the people who take the time to look between the lines, or walk through walls. And for that, Restless thanks us for our endurance, and leaves us with this. This is the first and only teaser for Project Readjusted 4, a game that wasn't even supposed to happen. Actually, let's pause for a moment. I have to come clean. This is not a teaser for Project Readjusted 4, because there is no such thing. Instead, this is a teaser for Jet Black, a stealth and escape horror experience created on Unreal Engine 5. Jet Black is in no way related to Five Nights at Freddy's or Project Readjusted. Except it kinda is. Listen, coming clean again, Jet Black had probably the weirdest development cycle I've seen from a game. The project was announced as a sort of Project Readjusted 4, was then later scrapped after the pair, and then came back some time later, fully embracing the Jet Black subtitle as the project's name. and then that version was supposed to be its own original game, which would have been sold for actual money and would have gone up on Steam. This would have presumably been Mechless's big break from the FNAF franchise, as he finally can make money off his games. There's just a lot to unpack here, and I apologize if I get a lot of this wrong. A good majority of this game's development was hidden from the general public, but we do get enough to form a general synopsis. When the pair initially came to light, the three main developers in the group chat, Ultraknight, Romanov, and Mechless, aborted their current projects after pretty much everyone retaliated against them. Ultraknight would cancel Chompers, Romanov left the juniors team, and almost guaranteed the game wouldn't be released, and Mechless dropped a photo album of all concept art and promotional material that would have been used for Jet Black, which at the time was still known as PR4. I'm sure that almost none of what was shown in the original photo album was changed in the transition from PR4 to Jet Black, except for the removal of any and all ties to FNAF. We know that Jet Black would have been made in Unreal Engine 5, and its gameplay would center around this free-roam casino environment. Mostly all characters from the Project Readjusted series would return, donning a new outfit to match the theme. The team was greatly expanded, and even at the time of its eventual cancellation, was still looking for help. Even after all the progress the team had made, it simply wasn't meant to be, as sometime after the 2023 New Year, Jet Black and all of its promotional material was stripped from the GameJolt page and Mechless' social media. Mechless would later go on to say that he just wasn't enjoying making the game. However, this wasn't entirely true. Mechless presumably continued to work on Jet Black. A couple more updates were shared either briefly on his GameJolt or his Discord server. In an attempt to cut all ties with Project Readjusted and FNAF, as a larger subgenre, Mechless replaced Buster with a new primary antagonist. And while I did try to find an archive of the original announcement post, I think for the time being it's as good as lost. In early June 2023, Mechless finally pulled the plug on Jet Black, halting all progress. After nearly 2 years of on and off progress, updates, and supposed cancellations and rebrandings, Jet Black was finally laid to rest. It's a real shame too. I'm usually a fan of more linear free-roam games, and from what was shown it had a ton of polish. Even if it wasn't a Project Readjusted game at its core, it will always be Project Readjusted 4 at heart. It's a shame that this would have been Mechless' final hurrah in the Project Readjusted series. Oh shit. Show of hands, how many of you thought that the series, the one with the murderous cult and killer robot dog, would eventually evolve into an online free-for-all game in the style of FNAF World? If you raised your hand, I really hope you take a moment to realize what you just agreed to. Released shortly after Jet Black's cancellation in early July, Bust 'em Up is the Project Readjusted online free-for-all experience, starring who else but Buster the dog as he fights against other Busters. When I first heard of this game, I thought it was some tech demo, and yeah, I definitely wasn't wrong, but what I wasn't expecting was how insanely content-rich this small game actually is. Like, this is the perfect game for an hour's worth of goofy, Project Readjusted related shenanigans with your friends. This game is multiplayer, and an incredibly fun multiplayer game at that. So I gathered a bunch of my close friends into a lobby, and we played Bust 'em Up in probably the least skillful way possible. Oh yeah, I'm in lobby 2, We're in lobby 2.
SirFiftyFive!
Oh no, yeah, I'm
Oh
in
my
server
God.
2. I'm in server 2.
So once you cross that line, it's a free-for-all. So you can actually damage each other once you cross that line.
Gamers! Gamers, that's
All
cool.
right.
Come here.
Fucking die! No!
I killed SirFiftyFive.
Do I respawn? Oh, I do. Oh, you fucking...
What the fuck?
What?
Okay.
What?
You laugh. And I'm busting to die.
What's over here?
Bro, stop fucking teleporting and then coming like...
Oh my god. Wait.
No!
What the fuck? How did that
I'm
one tap
trying.
to me?
I
I haven't killed anyone! Stop!
Bro,
No.
Yes!
No.
I got Seth. I got Seth.
Get away!
Oh wait, this is actually insane. Get back here, little boy. Yes, this is actually insane.
What is that? How do you
No! I got fucking sniped.
No.
get
Wait.
my favorite one.
Oh, we got it.
Not on my screen. Not on my screen, we didn't.
Oh,
Me and sir.
Oh, we got it.
no, we all got it. But hey, get back in line.
Get back in line. Back in formation.
Oh.
Dude, this shit is.
Oh my.
Band for band.
You are not going band for band.
Alright, what's your KDI?
0.64.
0.66 L.
Dude, my KDR is still higher than yours. What do you mean L? Stop shooting inward. Just get in here.
No. No.
You are so
I'm gonna
cheap.
kill somebody.
You are so corny. Stop doing that.
I think you still fucking died. I stepped out, you still died.
You are still corny, bro. You are so corny.
Yeah.
Alright, on the count of 3, we all cross the red line and fight to the death. None of us are allowed to cross back in until there's one left, alright?
Alright,
Alright.
3.
3, 2,
2, 1.
1.
No!
I died.
Bring it around. I be behind my girl like this.
Bro, shut up. You're so weird. You know, there are gonna be people watching this like hour-long video essay, and then halfway through this portion's gonna be in the video to break it
No,
up.
I be behind you like this. I be behind you like this.
Hey,
Oh,
hey,
behind her.
stop.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Oh, yeah.
Wait, watch this.
Bring it around. Town.
Hater. Wait.
Bring it around town.
Wait.
You're just standing on top of them.
Dude, why am I? Wait, I'm like behind you, so you should be the one doing the thing. I should be the one doing this.
No, that's like fucking.
No, I killed him! I fucked him
killed
too
him.
hard.
You looking too hard. Now
You
I need to
just
go
got
on behind my
killed.
girl. People, she bend over.
Shut the fuck up. And that's why me and my friends are banned in most public spaces. Anyway, Bust 'em Up was a really fun experience. Definitely give it a shot. Crazy enough, we are not done talking about PR3 just yet. For the entirety of 2023, Mechless was incredibly active, tweaking and updating the previous Project Readjusted games. In February, he released version 2.5 of Project Readjusted 2, which rebalanced the gameplay and added that busted-ass minigame that I was talking about. And then in August, Mechless released Project Readjusted 3 version 3. I initially considered talking about version 3 as a part of my Project Readjusted 3 section, similar to how I primarily talk about version 2.5 of PR2 during that section. But I figured that since version 3 of PR3 is vastly different from version 2, it deserves its own section. Also, this finally serves as the series' official curtain call. I'm not going to go too deep into this game and its changes since most of them are very minimal, but there are a couple of things I really want to talk about. In my original PR3 video, I talked a lot about difficulty and how mechanics were explained to the player. Version 3.0 fixed pretty much every complaint I had, which was nice to see. I'm just some guy on the internet who makes very strongly opinionated videos, and seeing that my advice was actually taken to heart means a lot. First and foremost, some of the main gameplay was changed. The minigame you have to play to get more supplies is the most notable change. Now you have to order these numbers from 1 to 7 correctly to get supplies. It's all based on a timer now, so the faster you complete it, the more supplies you'll get. You can get up to 3 in one go if you're quick enough. Also changed is the fact that you don't have to stop the conveyor to start a new minigame. This is a massive complaint for me, especially during attempts of a Daredevil's trial, where you had to be very quick to start the conveyor button in time. You can just leave it running for the entire time, which makes Matthew way easier to deal with. However, to counteract this buff, the patients will start to lose supplies. There's a timer now above their supply meter, and it'll start ticking down. Only when you send more supplies to them will it start over. Another great balance was added for 3A. He'll now make a louder sound when he's in the office. Also, when flipping down the camera panel, he'll be visible in the office for a split second. So you'll know for sure if you have to ring the bell or not. This helps out with situations where both Busted and 3A are in the office, as ringing the bell will either save your life or very abruptly end it. The glow stick was also heavily nerfed, having a much shorter battery life that slowly recharges over a longer period of time. I guess it's to prevent you from sitting in the office and waiting for Busted's audio cue and not doing anything on the camera panel. I don't want to go into every single change that was made to the gameplay, because we'd be here forever, but I want to state that overall, the gameplay was rebalanced and is a lot more fun to play. There is one more change that was added to 3.0, and it's with the max modes. A Daredevil's Trial now has a cutscene after completing it, which is short enough for me to play right now. If you remember from earlier, Project Readjusted 3 ends on a pseudo cliffhanger. While the story can be wrapped up there, Project Readjusted 4 would have explained and finished things off in a much better way. Now that it's been cancelled, this is the official end of the story. Matthew's plans laid to rest. There is one last change that I want to talk about before moving on. There is another max mode. Act of Penance is the secret custom night preset, and it's almost identical to a Daredevil's Trial, except now all characters have an AI of 30, and the office has a blue tint. It's a fun additional challenge that adds an 8th star into the menu. I guess what I've been trying to say for the past few minutes is that this is really the last piece of content we'll ever get for something Project Readjusted related. And seeing the game go out on a relatively high note is nice to see, especially with the controversy the series has been in. But now that we've covered everything, there's still one last thing to talk about. I've danced around the story and the finer details quite a bit, so let's do this, the Project Readjusted story. Just as a disclaimer before I begin, the complete original intention of the Project Readjusted story is currently unknown. We have just enough to form a conclusion, but I doubt it's what Meklis' original intention was. He never actually bothered to write down his own lore anywhere, he had just remembered it in between entries. Now that he's moved on, he just forgot it all. One more thing, while I'm about 99% sure what I have is accurate, it's possible some smaller details were missed. Check the pinned comment for any corrections. Alright, here we go. Our story begins in the late 1990s with Diner World Entertainment, a company specializing in mascot-themed restaurants. One of Diner World's most important early works was creating a rabbit animatronic. He went unnamed for a while, but was referred to as Subject Model Number 3A. His name was likely going to be Subject, but that's unknown. What is known is that Subject Model Number 3A would demonstrate odd behaviors when on camera, and was deemed unfit for a restaurant environment. That and the fact that test audiences didn't resonate well with 3A had him temporarily disabled and isolated from the public and broader Diner World staff. Around this time, the company started work on 2 new animatronics that were supposed to join 3A on stage. Subject Model Number 3B and C were created. The original plan was that they would first accompany 3A on stage, but if test audiences liked them more and felt that they didn't need 3A, it would be disabled and placed into storage for use of parts in the future. This ended up happening, and 3A was put into storage. 3B and C, known as Glancer and Glossy, got their own restaurant and took the spotlight. A little soon after, Diner World started work on a new main character. They came up with Buster, a robot dog. They made another iteration of him in the form of Redeemer, but he was ultimately shifted out after a short period. While this happened, Matthew was hired to help design the robots. One of his first jobs was to create a brand new rendition of Buster. After some time, Matthew made his iconic Buster we know from PR1. Once he was finished with him, he was also tasked with making him capable of free roam. His specific task was to work on the night mode functionality. While testing, he made Buster aggressive to better see how advanced his capabilities were. Matthew had no plans of ever changing him back. As a result, Buster would end up in a new position every morning. On top of this, Matthew also finds himself in trouble when he decides to dismantle the old Glancer and Glossy characters and fuse them into Glancy. His rationale was that this would save space, and the leftover parts could be used to make an entirely new character. Matthew would be fired, and a couple months later, the Buster's location seen in PR1 would close its doors. A month later, Matthew had the idea to return to the restaurant and collect the chip inside Vineyard. He thought he could get his job back by collecting it and returning it to Diner World. One issue: since the building had been closed for a month, the animatronics which were still active and set to their aggressive night setting would still be active inside. Matthew wasn't entirely comfortable going inside alone just yet, so he convinced his friend and former Diner World employee, Andrew, to help him. Matthew convinced him to call up his friend Hayden, a journalist, to offer him a job looking over the place during the night. They don't ever tell Hayden that he's only being used as bait to lure out Vineyard. The plan works for a few nights until Matthew and Andrew finally get enough courage to go inside. While they're looking for Vineyard, they are also looking for documentation on the chip to see if it's compatible with any of the other animatronics. While they're looking, Matthew runs into an investigator who is there looking into Diner World. Matthew tells Andrew to run off and kills the investigator. It's never revealed why Matthew decided to kill him, but it's potentially because he would have taken documents that would have been important for Matthew to get his job back. He takes the body out back and into a dumpster for later use. When the two meet back up, they finish getting what they needed and have Hayden finish his work. Somewhere in all of this, Hayden finds disturbing footage, potentially of the murder, but it's never confirmed. Hayden tells Andrew what he's seen and how he will turn it into the police. Andrew convinces him not to, saying that he's already done so. Andrew did not. A week later, Matthew, already after abandoning Andrew, comes back to the restaurant to retrieve the body. His best idea was to stuff the body inside an old Glancer suit. He does so successfully, but damages the suit a bit in the process. He places the suit back into storage, just in time for Diner World to turn their storage facility into a restaurant. Now very concerned about Matthew's whereabouts, Andrew attempts to find him. He finds a job listing for a night watchman at the storage facility. He applies and gets accepted. His job is simple: keep an eye on the place and look for signs of Matthew whenever possible. After 2 nights on the job, Andrew discovers the investigator's body inside the Glancer suit. He opts not to report this to the police for the time being, hoping that he can find Matthew and get answers before someone else sees it. After only a few more nights on the job, he finds a tape recorded by Matthew explaining his plan and how he's already dead. Andrew gets the motivation to turn this and the body inside the Glancer suit into the police. Before anything can happen, Andrew has a heart attack. Andrew survives, but changes his mind again, forgetting Matthew and moving on. Some time later, Andrew gets a phone call from a mysterious person. They claim they know where Matthew is and have more than enough answers to his questions. All he needs to do is play the game that they've set up for him. Andrew returns to the storage facility on a lower level to play the game. He needs to keep 3 patients alive, all people who have dirt on Diner World. These people are untrusting of Andrew, claiming that a man in a rabbit mask has threatened them not to tell him anything until enough time has passed. Throughout the week, Andrew has a lot of doubt if he should ever continue pressing forward. He remembers times when he worked for Diner World and saw children injured at the restaurant. This gives him enough motivation to keep going. He finds letters and documents scattered around from higher-ups at Diner World, talking about this computer called the HICM, which controls every animatronic they've ever created. He also finds a newspaper article on this weird robot found lurking outside of an unmarked building in a forest. After only 3 nights of working for the mysterious person, they show themselves, occasionally showing up during Andrew's shift to check up on him. Their identity is covered by a rabbit mask. This is our first real look at the Subjected, a cult with Matthew being the only member. He formed the Subjected to give Andrew another reason to keep pushing forward. From Matthew checking up on Andrew to Busted lurking around, there is one more challenge for Andrew to overcome. Subject model number 3A, one of the earliest working animatronics, is back and is hunting Andrew. The HICM is being used to control both Busted and 3A, making them incredibly aggressive. Andrew survives all of this and completes his task. The patients are released and tell Andrew what they know. The story ends with another note Andrew found, confirming that Matthew is still out there, his plans abandoned, living a new life under a new identity, his plans laid to rest. And that's it. It's an interesting story, one that I felt was way too complicated by its details. Even if dumbed down, it's fairly straightforward. So now that we've spent some time looking at the history of Project Readjusted, where does it stand now? It's been nearly 8 years since the first game was released, and the series as a whole has never been more popular. Something that I've noticed within the past 6 months is that more people are starting to look at this series than ever before. It's not just PR3 either. People are actively seeking out the other 2 mainline entries as well. Speaking of the other entries, everything that isn't PR3 has been delisted on GameJolt, and can only be accessed with a link. This is probably because they haven't arguably held up as well as the third, which is a shame to see. I firmly believe that Project Readjusted is one of the most unique and interesting fan series that we'll ever see. Yes, it has some paper-thin lore with some questionable games, but I honestly believe that's what makes this series so special. It's very evident that a lot of care was put into it, even if the care didn't fully translate to polish. But to me personally, that doesn't really matter. A full story was told from start to finish, and that in itself is a feat many developers can't accomplish. I've praised this series a lot in this video, and hopefully for good reason. Not only has it inadvertently changed my life, but for many others as well. This series means a lot to me, and it's with great pride that I can say that now, more than ever, people are looking into it. I've wanted to make this video for 2 years, but couldn't bring myself to do it with the controversies of the developer. And while we may never hear from him again in the same way, Project Readjusted is far from falling out of relevancy. Obviously, I hope this video does well, or at least inspires a few people out there to maybe try their hand at something similar. Who knows? Maybe someone will remake the series, improving all the faults I mentioned thus far. Only time will tell, but you better believe they'll be right here to experience it whenever it does. When I started work on this video, nearly 5 months ago, I didn't really know what to expect. I initially wanted this video to be a re-review of Project Readjusted 3, one where I'd actually go into detail about its story and try to fully break down every little detail, which was something I tried to do with my initial review, but evidently failed. I have such a massive appreciation for Project Readjusted 3. I think that's something I've made incredibly obvious if you've seen my Twitter. I've had so much to say on this game ever since I made my initial review. I knew I would be talking about it again someday. Even with all the ups and downs this series has gone through, I really do wish I took this deep dive sooner. Researching, planning, scripting, and editing this very video have been some of my favorite memories creating content in a long time, and I hope that I can continue creating and sharing these memories. As for the content I covered in this video itself, I knew that I would be in for a long ride when I realized how many games there actually are in the Project Readjusted series. But what I didn't expect was how much I'd enjoy them. Seriously, playing most of these games for the first time was an incredible experience. It's something I didn't at all expect. especially with how the earlier games were regarded by its developer. This series is admittedly very old. Well, as old as it gets for most fan games, and for that reason, I think I've tempered my expectations a considerable amount, especially for the earlier entries. So, thank you to the couple of comments on my original video asking me to check out the rest of the series. I also want to take this time to thank a few people who made this video possible. Starting off with Rainbow Hype and Ion, who both know a little too much about PR1 and 2. They inadvertently helped me get the gameplay of PR2 down. Rainbow Hype made an incredible guide for the AI in PR2, and Ion helped piece together a majority of the unknown bits from PR1. Seriously, thank you. I couldn't forget about Dice Games for his incredible support and generosity. I met him during the production of my original video, and he's been an incredibly close and supportive friend ever since. Besides maybe myself, he's also the biggest Project Readjusted fan that I know. So if it wasn't for his immense enthusiasm for the series, this video wouldn't have ever been released. If he hadn't released that guide for PR3, I probably would have given up hope on making my original video as well. And finally, of course, Mechless, for not only creating Project Readjusted, but for his incredible support and praise of my work, even when he evidently wanted to leave these games behind him. He also helped write a good portion of the story section in this video, which was much appreciated, considering I was pretty far off in my original draft. I don't know what's in store for you or your work, but I'm here for it. That's all I have for you from this incredibly long video. If you made it to the end, thank you. I hope this video wasn't too boring, but you'll have to let me know. In the pinned comment, I'll be making corrections, because I know for a fact there will be something that I missed. Other than that, thank you for watching.